National Symposium. I would just like to start by thanking every professor that has given a talk, every commentator who has commented on their papers. This has been a very stimulating symposium. The discussions were excellent. So thank you very much for everyone who was here also and participated in the discussions. I've just listened to them. I hope it was as fun for you as it was for us in the organizing committee. And let's see if we do this again. I'm already inviting Pedro and Luiz to, to do it again. Let's see if they accept it. Anyway, so welcome to the last session. In this last session, we'll be hearing talks from Professors Jessica Moss and Marco Zingano and commentary by Pedro Dotto and Luiz Fernando Pereira Aguiar. So I'll start by introducing our first two speakers. Professor Jessica Moss is Professor of Philosophy at New York University. Her primary area of research is ancient philosophy, and she especially writes about epistemology, ethics, and psychology. She is the author of books such as Aristotle on the Apparent Good, Perception, Fantasia, Thought, and Desire, which came out at Oxford University Press in 2012. And most recently, Plato's Epistemology, Being and Seeming. This is hot out of the presses. It's published in 2022, as well as numerous very important articles. Professor Moss has also previously held positions at the University of Pittsburgh and at Balliol College in Oxford. And then giving a commentary to her paper will be Pedro Dotto. Pedro Dotto is a PhD candidate in philosophy at the New School for Social Research in New York. And he's currently writing his dissertation on the theme of persuasion and psychology in Plato's Phaedrus. So, Professor Jessica Moss, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for the invitation. And it's a pleasure to be here. And I'm really sorry that I did not make it to previous sessions. I would have liked to do that. But it's very nice to be here now. And okay, so I have a handout and you all have access to it, but I'm also going to share the screen. For those of you who don't like screen sharing, I only discovered very late in the Zoom game that you can actually minimize the shared part and maximize the picture part by dragging on a little line. So anyways, if you just don't want to look at it, that's no problem, but I will share this handout. Let's see if I got the right one. Let's see. Yes, okay. So, and just please interrupt me audibly if anything has gone wrong, technologically speaking. Also, I know I have background noise. There's construction outside because I'm in New York, but if that becomes too distracting, let me know and I'll close the window. There's a pleasant breeze, which is making me happy, but it's a little loud. Okay, so all of that said, this is a talk that, well, it has the title of Philosophical Dogs, Plato on Knowledge and Familiarity. As was just mentioned, I recently completed a book on Plato's epistemology, and this is really kind of a separate project in a way, although I think it's compatible. And I was really happy, you'll see in Pedro's comments that he kind of drew more connections between my book and the paper than I had really thought through. So there will be something there, but this is in some sense a self-standing project. So to begin with, Plato spends a lot of time in the Republic as elsewhere, but I'm focusing on the Republic, talking about and trying to convince us to believe in and strive for this really special kind of condition. And he calls it episteme, or sometimes he calls it Sophia, or sometimes nous or noesis, by which I mean something like what the philosophers have, the top level of the line, what you get when you get out of the cave, and so on. And he characterizes it a lot by characterizing it on its own terms. For example, as I argue in the book, it is cognition of what is, or it's very clear, or it's very true, stable, and so on. But he also, a lot of his characterizations of this great condition, episteme or Sophia, are by contrasting it with something worse than it. So, for example, in the powers argument in book 5, we get the contrast between episteme, which philosophers have, and doxa, which the sight lovers have. And then more elaborately in the line and in the cave in books 6 and 7, the best condition is at the top, but it's on a line with, or in a progression for the cave with 3 other conditions. So you have eikasia, imagination, pistis, trust or conviction, dianoia, thought, and then at the top, episteme or nous. So the implication is that somehow episteme belongs with these other things. Not that they're identical to it, certainly they're much worse than it, but that somehow it is natural / illuminating to compare and contrast episteme with those things in a way that it wouldn't, for example, be natural or illuminating to compare and contrast episteme with eating or desiring or maybe even perceiving. So the question that I want to ask, and I want to be clear, I don't think this is a question that Plato explicitly asks or explicitly answers. But the question I want to ask is, what is the wider class to which episteme belongs? And maybe just to give you some sort of background for this, I think, and I'm working on a project on Aristotle's epistemology, I think Aristotle is interested in this question to some extent, and he gives an explicit answer. He thinks of nous and episteme as being kinds of what he calls gnosis. This is not on the handout, but we can come back to it. And he thinks that perception is a kind of gnosis and techne is a kind of gnosis and so on. So Aristotle at least has a kind of common category. It looks like Plato doesn't really ask this question or answer it. Now, you might think he does a bit by looking at the powers argument or looking at the line or the cave. There are some words that he applies to all 4 stages on the line, or to both the things in the powers argument, but these words are just too general. So in the powers argument in book 5, we get the idea that both episteme and doxa are dunamis, powers. But that's too broad to say, well, that's the specific class we're looking at, because lots of other things are powers too, like strength, for example. And then on the divided line, he refers to all 4 stages on what we might call the mental side as pathemata, affections or things one undergoes, but that's also way too broad. That could include emotions or being physically sick or things like that. So I don't see anywhere where Plato introduces a kind of technical vocabulary word that's meant to cover all and only the things that with which episteme is naturally and illuminatingly contrasted. Later people do so on his behalf. So for example, Proclus, when he's discussing the divided line, he refers to all 4 from eikasia up to noesis as gnoses. So gnosis, the same word that I just said Aristotle uses, I think, for this class. But if we look back to Plato, it doesn't look like he would call, certainly not eikasia, gnosis, and I think probably not even the higher kind. So that's not Plato's own term. It's something that I think a later author is offering him. Contemporary answers. So when I've written about this myself, I have used this kind of fuzzy phrase, cognitive kinds. Episteme and doxa are both kinds of cognition, or they're cognitive kinds, and other people use that too. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I don't think it's very illuminating either. It's almost like a placeholder. Mental, cognitive, something to do with taking in information about the world or something like that. And then there also is the suggestion that's sometimes made that these are all different kinds of belief. So doxa is one kind of belief and episteme is another kind of belief, or pistis is one kind and eikasia. So that's a view that I have argued against in my paper with Whitney Schwab called The Birth of Belief. I'm not really concerned to argue against it right now. In fact, if you want to hold it, I'm sort of at peace with that. But what I'd want to say is that it's not the most illuminating or interesting answer we can give. It's not a great fit with Plato, and we can say something, we can tell a better story about why these things belong together. It might be one compatible with saying that in all of these you have beliefs and they're better and worse. So what I want to do today, instead of arguing against any of those proposals, is argue for a positive proposal of my own, and that I have underlined on your handout. It says my proposal. So this is a answer to the question, what is the wider class to which episteme and doxa and all their kinds belong? And my proposal is that we should think of the class as something like familiarity or acquaintance. And I'll say more about what I mean by that. Caveat, I don't mean what you probably think of as Russellian acquaintance. I'll say more, but familiarity or being well acquainted with reality. So that's the general class. Episteme is the best kind and eikasia is the worst kind. And then I'll kind of qualify that a bit at the end and say, well, maybe it's not even just best and worst, but maybe the class is familiarity, genuine or sham, fake imitation with reality. So maybe the worst kinds are not just lesser, but they're not even the real thing. But nonetheless, that would be a way to define a class, just like you could define the class of real gold and imitation gold. That's a that's a sort of a natural kind. Okay, so what I will argue is that the highest kind, episteme, is the highest kind because it is genuine good acquaintance. And it's the best kind of good acquaintance we can have with reality. In that condition, we are really well acquainted with reality. And the lower kinds are lesser acquaintance with reality, or maybe even sham acquaintance with reality. And furthermore, they have that status, that lesser inferior status, because their acquaintance with aspects of reality that don't admit of better acquaintance. So in other words, it's not just that they're intrinsically worse, it's that they're worse because their objects are worse. And their objects are worse in the specific way that they're things you can't get very well acquainted with. Okay, I will turn to putting some flesh on all this in just a moment. But before I do that, I wanted to say, why am I asking this question at all? So one should always be careful when asking a question about, say, Plato, that Plato himself doesn't seem to be asking, right? And sometimes I think we can be anachronistic, which is okay, but we should know that we're doing it. And sometimes I think we can be looking for precision or a determinate answer where there just isn't one to be given. And that can be kind of fruitless or even kind of misleading in some way. I think this is a worthwhile question to ask for two reasons. One is, I think we can better illuminate episteme by understanding what it has in common with these lower kinds. So we get a better understanding of what it is by seeing why it belongs on this line rather than on some other line, or this progression rather than some other progression. And the other thought is, given the answer that I think is right, the answer I've just said, where what they have in common is being kinds of acquaintance with reality, I think we can credit Plato with something we might not have thought to credit him with, which is having a theory, or at least a kind of proto-theory of knowledge, or maybe of cognition. So you might think, and I've pretty much have argued in my book and elsewhere, Plato's not really interested in giving a general theory of what we would call knowledge. He's interested in the best thing. He's interested in episteme, and the lesser kinds, he's interested just insofar as they're kind of obstacles to it. But if I'm right in this paper, then we can at least get out of Plato something that I think we find more explicitly in Aristotle, which is there is a general notion of knowledge. Plato wouldn't want to give it any term of praise like knowledge, but there is a general notion of something that we would recognize as knowledge. And that notion is something like, okay, I'm going to say my Portuguese word that I was just taught, conhecimento. Yeah, being well, gnosis in Greek, I think connaissance in French, being well acquainted with reality. Okay, so I'm now on section 2, and I forgot to bold the title to section 2. Let's see if I can do it while we speak. Amazing. Okay, so philosophical dogs. Sophia or episteme, I'm using those interchangeably for these purposes, as good acquaintance with reality. So in order to argue for this thesis that the thing at the top is good acquaintance with reality, and therefore the larger thesis that the whole category is this category of acquaintance with reality, there's various places one could start. I want to start with a passage that I like a lot. It's a passage that always stuck in my mind when reading Plato. I thought it was silly at first. I thought it was sort of obviously meant to be a joke. And I still think it's meant to be a joke, but I've come to think that it's meant to be a kind of illuminating, philosophically interesting joke. So the context is that Socrates is talking with his interlocutors about how we're going to get guardians and how we're going to choose the right people to be guardians. And it seems like we've got this difficult situation where we need people who are at this both spirited and also philosophical. And then he says, oh, actually, we can see there is a precedent for this because we see it in dogs. Okay, so we know dogs are spirited. They have plenty of thumos, but what's the argument that dogs are philosophoi, that they are philosophical? And he gives the following argument, text 1, T1, and I've given the whole thing in Greek if you want it. But this too is something that you will observe in dogs, that whatever it sees an unknown person, that's an agnota. And that's just the ordinary word that you would use for someone you haven't met, or a stranger, or someone who's not familiar to you. It gets angry, even if it hasn't undergone a single bad thing from him before. But whenever it sees a gnorimos, gnorimon person, where that's the very standard word you would use for someone who is known to you. So in Greek, you can use it for a familiar person in the sense of someone you've met personally, you're acquainted with, also a celebrity. And somewhat oddly, also the gnorimoi are the noble or the highborn, where I think that means something like they're the kind of notable people who are worth knowing. That's how I've interpreted that. But anyways, at least in this context, it clearly means someone the dog has encountered several times before, is familiar. So whenever it sees a gnorimon, known person, it welcomes him, even if it has never undergone any good thing from him. Surely that trait of a dog's nature appears exquisite and truly wisdom-loving, philosophos, in that it distinguishes a friendly from a hostile sight by nothing other than having learned the one and being ignorant of the other. And indeed, how could something not be a lover of learning, philomathes? And if you recall, sometimes he talks about the rational part of the soul as philosophos, and sometimes as philomathes, a learning loving. So how could something not be a lover of learning who demarcates what is akin, oikeon, from what is alien by understanding and ignorance? But surely the learning loving and wisdom loving are the same. Then shouldn't we confidently assume that also in the case of humans, if they're to be gentle to people who are akin and gnorimoi, known, they must be wisdom loving and learning loving. Okay, so this is a pretty weird argument. The argument is you can tell dogs are philosophical because they only bark at people they don't know. How is this argument supposed to work? I will say, just as a side note, I think it's Adam, one of the old commentaries on the Republic has a helpful passage that's talking about the cynics and says this is one of the reasons that the cynics were so called, is that dogs bark at people they don't know. So maybe that came later than Plato. Maybe Plato was making fun of the cynics. Hard to know. But in any case, it might look like just kind of a bad argument. I think it's not a bad argument. I think it's a valid and interesting argument. So I have put it into premise and conclusion form for you here. I think we should understand it like this. Premise one, dogs love familiar people. You can see that because they fawn all over them and they bark at unfamiliar people. Premise two, this shows that dogs love familiarity. So I think that's what we should understand him to say when they demarcate, sorry, where was it up here? They demarcate what is akin from what is alien by understanding and ignorance. Maybe that's not the most explicit there, but I think the idea is why would they bark only at people they don't know? Why would they fawn on people that they do know? It must be that they love just this knowing, this kind of familiarity. And then somehow we get to a conclusion, I'm skipping premise three for a moment, that dogs love wisdom and learning. Now, how could you get from dogs love familiarity, even if you grant that premise two follows from premise one, how could you get from premise two to the conclusion? It looks like there must be an implicit premise here, my premise three, wisdom is familiarity. Otherwise, it's just a total non sequitur, right? Dogs love familiarity, dogs are philosophical, doesn't work. So I think he must be assuming this. Wisdom is familiarity. This is meant to show something like, and now I'm expanding premise three, the philosopher's wisdom consists in something very parallel to what the dogs have. Dogs are familiar with people who are akin to them, and where that maybe just means people they've met before. And philosophers are familiar with the things that are relevant, that is to say, the objects of wisdom, which are, as we know, the forms. Okay, so that's what I want to, that's what I think this argument implies. And then I think we get very good evidence later on that that is actually something that Plato holds, so that there is this parallel. As the dog is to the familiar person, so the philosopher is to the forms. So here's a passage that is going to support that. This is from quite a bit later when we're talking about what it's like to get up to the top of the line or out of the cave. My text 2 from Republic 490, it is the nature of the real lover of learning. So maybe even we could have that real, the ontos philomathes. Maybe that's a contrast with the sight lovers, but maybe it's even a contrast with the dogs, who we saw were sort of philomathes. It's the nature of the real lover of learning to struggle towards what is. I think that's the forms. They will go on, will not dull or let go of their eros. So suddenly we find out the philosophers love the forms, similar to how dogs were fawning all over, loving the people. that they know, until they grasp the being of each nature itself, which that of their soul, which it befits to grasp this kind of thing. So maybe that's meant to be the rational part, logistikon. Maybe that's even meant to be some more specific thing within it, nous. It befits that which is akin. That's Zingano there. Earlier, I sort of cheated. I translated oikeon as akin, but there's certainly words that go together naturally. Aristotle will use them almost as synonyms. And through having approached and mixed with what really is, and having begat nous and truth, they know, gnosis there, gnoie, and truly live and are nourished. Okay. So what I think we see from this passage is what the philosophers have in relation to the forms is, primarily speaking, what I will call an objectual attitude. I'll say more about that in a moment, but it's a relationship to an object, just like the dog has a cognitive relationship to people, rather than primarily to facts or propositions. So we're seeing here the philosopher's wisdom consists in a kind of, or the goal of philosophical education, which is wisdom, consists in a relationship to these objects, the forms. So that's one parallel with dogs. Another parallel is that, as in the case of the dogs, this cognitive relationship derives from kinship with the object. There's something akin in the philosopher's soul to the forms, just as there's something akin, maybe they belong to the same neighborhood or something, the dogs and the people that the dog knows. And another parallel is that it entails love for the object. So we saw that the dogs fawn all over the people that they know. And here we see that the philosopher has eros for the forms. So I want to say we can take this idea, having this objectual attitude towards something that involves loving it and that derives from kinship with it and is a cognitive relationship, a mental relationship of some kind. Let's call that familiarity. What is this thing? And I want to use it interchangeably with what I'm calling acquaintance, good acquaintance. So what is this thing? Well, what we can tell on the basis of what we have so far is that it's the kind of relationship you have to someone you know, or the kind of relationship you, if you're a philosopher, you have to the forms. I am using the word good acquaintance. I think that that is a kind of standard idiomatic English thing to say I'm well acquainted with something. The reason I didn't want to just stick with familiarity is that I think familiarity has such strong connotations of frequent exposure. So to say, are you familiar with this? It doesn't have to mean, but it kind of implies, have you seen it more than once? And I'm thinking, imagine you're a philosopher and you just got out of the cave and you are spending your first day out of the cave just admiring the form of the good. I think at the end of that day, you could be well acquainted with the form of the good, even though you haven't encountered it many times. So that's why I want to bring in good acquaintance rather than just familiarity. But caveat, which I mentioned before, for philosophers now, acquaintance has this very strong association with Russell, knowledge by acquaintance. And in ancient philosophy, this has an important past. So I guess beginning with Ryle in the 20th century, there was a whole theory that Plato thought of, maybe it's even before Ryle, but Ryle kind of brought it to prominence, that Plato thought of our knowledge of forms as acquaintance knowledge rather than description knowledge, where that meant that it had to be something like direct, unmediated contact, and also that it was somehow essentially non-propositional. So for Russell, acquaintance is what you have with your sense data, or with certain universals, but maybe in ordinary speaking, we could say acquaintance is what you have with something that's directly before your eyes, like the color that's before your eyes. When you just directly see it, it's not mediated by any description of the thing. It's not that someone told you about it, you just have it right before you. And also for Russell, acquaintance is really non-propositional in the first instance. So these two things, I think, distinguish it from what I want to call acquaintance here. Just to say briefly, and I know Pedro was going to raise some more questions about it, but I think Russellian acquaintance could, in principle, be fairly superficial and shallow. If what I'm acquainted with is just the color red that's in front of me right now on my screen, yeah, I mean, that's nice. I'm acquainted with it, but it's nothing very deep. Whereas I think for what Plato's thinking the dogs have, with the people they know, and even more so the philosophers have with the forms, is something much fuller and deeper. Maybe that's implied when you say connaître or something. I think in English, this idea of knowledge, knowing a person, for example, the kind of connaître knowing, it comes in degrees. So I could know someone just a bit, but to really know them, or I know them really well, that's going to be more than just I've met them or I've encountered them. Okay. And then second, it can be propositional. And by that, I mean, I want to just be neutral on this question for now. I think this isn't, I don't need to do it for this project, but I certainly don't mean to rule out a view. In fact, I believe the view that the philosopher's knowledge of forms is propositional. They can put it into a logos, or logos itself grasps it. They can defend in logos and so on. Okay, so that's that section that I've just done. Section 2 was sort of a first case for saying that we could think of wisdom, or episteme, the thing that's at the top of the line, as familiarity or good acquaintance with the forms. And now what I want to show is that thinking of it this way helps explain why it's on a line with pistis, eikasia, dianoia, why these things all belong together. And the basic idea is that they're going to be greater and lesser kinds of familiarity. And the reason that they are greater and lesser is that they're going to be familiarity with greater and lesser objects, where that means in particular objects that lend themselves to being known better or worse. So big picture thought here, what we want is, the goal is wisdom. Wisdom is being really well acquainted with what's most real. And what people have when they are, say, in the cave is something that in some sense approximates or imitates that. You're kind of quasi-familiar with things that are, that's all they can give you. Just like maybe a parallel would be what you want in your personal relationships is to get to know someone really well, but maybe you could have an approximation or an imitation of that where you're sort of, you know, there's someone that you've been texting with and you've never met, where you're kind of quasi acquainted with them, and maybe they're a bot, or, you know, a catfisher or something like that, or maybe they're just a superficial person. You're not really getting to know someone very well. So that's the big picture. And I want, this may be one of those cases where you try to illuminate something by comparison and you wind up opening a can of worms that is causing more trouble than you need to. I've been thinking about Aristotle on the notion of what's gnorimon, familiar or knowable by nature, versus to us. And I think that he and Plato are very similar on this topic. So if it's helpful to you, if you have certain thoughts about Aristotle on the knowable by nature, then this will be helpful. If not, you could almost just space out for the Aristotle part and then tune back in a moment. But Aristotle famously has this distinction between what's gnorimon to us and what's gnorimon by nature. And he thinks of education as proceeding. So this word gnorimon, that's the one we saw back up here in text 1, where whenever it sees a gnorimon person, familiar, something that's known. So Aristotle thinks of education as moving from attending to what's gnorimon to us, where that turns out to be perceptible things and particular things, and moving all the way up to what's gnorimon by nature, where those are the first principles of everything. Maybe I'll just only read one of these out, but it's in the nature, text 3 from the opening chapter of the physics. It's in the nature of the road towards principles and causes. In other words, towards the goal of inquiry. In other words, towards the best kind of knowledge. To be from what is more gnorimon and clearer to us. So that's where you start. To what is clearer and more gnorimon by nature. And there's a difference between these two. So start off with what's less clear by nature, but clearer to us, and go to what's clearer and more gnorimon by nature. So here's a summary of how I think Aristotle's understanding education. You start with perception and experience. That's all you have at the beginning of things that are more gnorimon to us. And I think we could understand that as you start with kind of superficial, low-level familiarity with objects that are suited to that. So, for example, the emperos, the person who has experience, they're pretty familiar with particular facts in their domain, but it's not a deep familiarity. And if they want kind of deep familiarity, deep acquaintance with reality, they're going to have to abandon these particular facts, and they're going to have to move upwards towards universal underlying causes and eventually first principles. So you start with this low-level stuff, and then you proceed to these high-level nous, episteme, sophia, of what's more gnorimon by nature, where we can understand what you're doing as proceeding to deep, high-level familiarity. So no longer just a superficial familiarity, a deep one, and it has to be of objects that are suited to this. Okay, so that's a brief summary of what I think is going on in Aristotle. Tune back in if you were stopping and not thinking about Aristotle. Plato's cave, I think, gives us in the Republic a parallel kind of progression. You'll notice in Aristotle, he groups in both of these quotations, text 3 and 4, he grouped more gnorimon with clearer. Plato doesn't use the word gnorimon in the cave allegory, and I'll return to that. I think that's significant. I think he wouldn't call the low-level thing gnosis, but we can come back to that. But he does use clearer, more and less clear. And I think that he's got a similar idea of the education. Remember, the journey out of the cave is meant to symbolize education. We can see education as proceeding from what's clear and more familiar to us to what's clear and more familiar by nature. So what's clearest to us is the cognition and the objects at the bottom. Prisoners are familiar with the shadows. They're good at identifying them and predicting them. So they have this kind of superficial, low-level familiarity with these things. But when they turn, so we could say the shadows are things that are clear and familiar by nature. Oh, sorry, no, clear and familiar to us. That is to say, to people as we are before we're educated. But the prisoners are much less familiar with and much less cognitively comfortable with the higher objects. So text 5 from the cave allegory, when the prisoner first turns around and sees the next level up, the statues, wouldn't his eyes hurt? Wouldn't he flee, turning away from the shadows, which he's able to observe, regarding them as in, whoops, I can't make this go away, as in reality clearer than the things now being shown. So in other words, in reality, by nature, statues are clearer than shadows, but to the prisoner, it's backwards. His eyes are better adjusted. He's better at looking at shadows when he looks at the statues. And then when he tries to look at the sun, you know, that's going to be a total disaster. Those things are less clear to him, even though more clear by nature. And I'll say more about this, but I think what we're getting here, the kind of cognition that the prisoner has with the shadows and lacks in the beginning with the higher things is really naturally thought of as something like familiarity or being well acquainted with these things. What they're not able to do with the statues is observe them or answer what it is or see these things. So it's like these things remain strange to them, strangers to them. They're not getting well acquainted with them. They're not becoming familiar with them. Okay. So the things at the top are not clear to us. When you start off, you're not able to observe them, but they are clear by nature. And the way I want to understand that is a way that I think Aristotle explains more explicitly. They're sort of such as to be clear to someone whose mind is in good condition. So once you've been educated, once you got out of the cave, once you've learned all these things, then you're going to be able to see these things really clearly, and you're going to be able to become familiar with them. And this clarity and this familiarity will be much more than what you had at the bottom, right? Just like I was saying, the kind of, you say, yeah, I got sort of familiar with this person that I was texting with, but actually the real kind of familiarity I can get with someone I actually converse with and get to know, it's just a whole different order of things. Okay, so about clarity, Plato is kind of explicit. Just as sunlight illuminates physical objects, allowing our eyes to see them clearly, so truth illuminates intelligible objects, allowing the soul to know, gignoskein them. So by analogy, the idea would be that the forms are the clearest kind of objects. We can know them most clearly. And on the divided line, he does say, as you go up the line from shadows all the way up to forms, the objects become clearer as you go, or the cognitions become clearer. And I think what he means there, like I said, is clear by nature. In other words, to one whose mind is ready. So look how great your familiarity with things are. Look how well you can see things, metaphorically speaking, how clearly when you got out of the cave. So text 6, finally, the guy who gets out of the cave would be able to see the sun itself by itself in its own place, observe what it was like. And after that, he would straight away reason about it, that this is what provides the seasons and the cycles and is in some way the cause of all the things he'd seen before. So this is really good acquaintance with something. You're looking at it, you're seeing everything that's important about it, and you have a kind of deep understanding of it. Just by looking at it and studying it carefully, you even come to realize that it's the cause of all these other things. So not a superficial acquaintance, like when you can recognize a shadow or predict which shadow is coming next, but a really deep and full acquaintance. And when I say acquaintance, I should, well, I'll say this in a moment, but I'll say it now too. I'm really contrasting this with certainty. Because if you come to Plato with what I think are kind of anachronistic expectations of his epistemology, you say, well, the difference between good cognition and bad cognition, or the difference between episteme and doxa, is going to be something like more justification or more certainty. And certainly some things Plato says fit well with that. But I think all that stuff is kind of derivative or epiphenomenal. I think the real difference, it's not that you have more certainty. The prisoner can be absolutely certain that that is a tree. It's really that you have more depth, you have more familiarity, you're getting to know the thing better. That's my claim. Okay, so in support of that, in support of the idea that what you have more of at the top and less of at the bottom, or what clear objects give you more of and unclear objects give you less of, is good acquaintance. So Plato very often links clarity with good acquaintance. What do I mean by that? I'll just give you one quotation. There's a lot more. He often does it in the context of talking about an account, a logos. So here's one example in the Euthyphro. Socrates says this famously confusing thing. Is the text 7, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved? And Euthyphro says, I don't know what you're saying, or I don't know what you mean. And Socrates says that I would try to speak more clearly. And we see this in various other cases also. Sometimes Socrates accuses someone else of not speaking clearly, or sometimes he apologizes for himself not speaking more clearly. And what he means in these cases seems to be something like, the words don't let you get an appreciation of the subject. The words are somehow obscuring the subject rather than revealing it. So if you're coming from, say, the Stoic tradition or from the Cartesian tradition, you might think, well, if it's a clear impression is one of which we can be certain, and an unclear one is one that's sort of open to doubt. I'm not sure if it's true or not. But Socrates isn't saying, oh, I said something that you might be in doubt about. Socrates is saying, I didn't really explain myself well enough, right? I need to speak more clearly. I need to give you clarity, the way that I put it here on the handout, clarity not as what affords certainty, but as what affords good acquaintance. An unclear account is one that obscures our mental view of its objects, either through lack of detail or through confusion or through ambiguity. Clarity in accounts is valuable because it illuminates the object, allows us to see the object fully, exactly as it is, etc., allows us to know things better, where this means not being more certain or more justified, but better acquainted. Okay, so I'm taking this connection with clarity as further evidence that the journey from out of the cave, the journey from studying objects that are less clear by nature to studying those more clear by nature, is a journey from better to worse acquaintance. Okay. All this was supposed to help us understand what the common class is, what does episteme have in common with doxa, and so on. As I mentioned, Aristotle has an answer. It is gnosis, which comes in degrees, which I think we should understand as conocimiento or connaissance, acquaintance, knowledge. And for Aristotle, he's happy to say, look, even perception is gnosis. It's just that when you have nous, you have more gnosis. Plato doesn't have any word, like I said, other than these really general ones like dunamis or pathema, that he wants to say, yeah, episteme is one, and so is eikasia or doxa down at the bottom. But I think we could see acquaintance as the common class, and it's lesser and greater, but it's not just lesser and greater, it's sham versus genuine. So again, I think that's a difference from Aristotle. Aristotle's an empiricist. He thinks perception really is a kind of knowledge. Plato thinks that perception and the kind of beliefs you have based on perception are on the wrong track somehow. So for him, it's not just going to be less, it's going to be somehow fake. So just quickly to run through ways that I think we could see this playing out. Let's go back to dogs versus real philosophers, philosophical dogs versus philosophical philosophers. What do they have in common? What do their mental conditions have in common? Well, they have kinship with the object in common, but what the dogs have is sham and or lesser kinship with their objects. So familiar people are akin to dogs only conventionally through habituation, whereas the forms, as we saw in text 2 and also in the Phaedo, are akin to us naturally through the similarity between their nature and the nature of the best part of our soul. So yes, they have in common kinship with objects, but it's sham kinship versus real kinship. Also sham versus lesser love. So dogs fawn on familiar people. That just seems like, puppy love or some kind of dog love. Whereas the philosopher has eros, real eros for the forms, as we saw in text 2, Republic 490. Sham and lesser clarity. The prisoners seem to themselves to see the shadows well. We saw that in text, I can't remember the number, but about what it's like in the cave. The philosophers truly see the forms with utter clarity. And then what I want to get out of all of this, sham, what the dogs have is familiarity, but it's sham or lesser familiarity, or what you have at the bottom, what you have when you have akasia or pistis. So prisoners in the cave are good at guessing which shadow will come next and identifying the shadows they see. This is the superficial counterpart of the philosopher's deep, full familiarity with the forms, their deep and full knowledge of them. Okay, so last thing I'll say, going back to text 1, the idea that dogs are philosophical, Plato is not saying all humans by nature desire to know. That's what Aristotle says, but we could take this text as, look, even in dogs, all creatures maybe, or great creatures like dogs and maybe other humans, we see from people's affection or creatures' affection for familiar things, we see that there's this love of familiarity or good acquaintance. And what genuinely gratifies this love is episteme. I'm just reading out here. For only in this condition do we really achieve what we want in wanting knowledge. What we really want is good acquaintance with reality. And when you have episteme, that's great because you really are well acquainted with reality. Lesser conditions are approximations or imitations of this. For in them we are less or pseudo sham well acquainted with lesser aspects of reality. And if we understand Plato this way, then we'll understand why these lesser conditions are in a class with episteme, why he chose pistis and so on to be on the line. And we'll also have a new understanding of why they're inferior to it. And finally, of why it's so superior. Okay, I talked a little longer than I meant, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jessica. This was very interesting. Now we're going to turn to Pedro Dotto, who's going to give his commentary. So Pedro, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Luiz is going to share his screen with my text, since I have some technical difficulties here in my hands as well with the sharing. So I'll begin. Professor Moss' paper is lucid, insightful, and well argued. Her line of reasoning is clear and steady, virtues that I take to be trademarks of her style of writing. The paper just presented can be understood, in my view, to be a further development of Moss' investigation of Plato's theory of knowledge, of which the 2021 book, Plato's Epistemology, Being and Seeming, by Oxford University Press, is the most comprehensive and recent product. As the analogy between the cognition of dogs and philosophers in Republic 376a to c worked out in today's exposition is not dealt with Moss in that book, but contributes directly to her chief points there. I take that the paper Philosophical Dogs, Plato, Knowledge and Familiarity, of which I'm honored to be responding to be an addend or a proscript to Plato's epistemology, or perhaps as a prelude to a book on Aristotle's epistemology, as just reviewed by Professor Moss. So, as I see it, Professor Moss' work on Plato's theory of knowledge, both in today's paper and the 2021 book, has a double edge. The first is what I would call as elentic or negative. The second is what I would name explanatory or positive. Hence, part of her effort is devoted to debunking contemporary epistemological presuppositions and prejudices that stand in the way of a proper understanding of Plato's conception of knowledge. A common and widespread prejudice that Professor Moss is keen to discredit is the equation of doxa with belief and episteme with knowledge. That is, thinking doxa in the technical contemporary sense in epistemological circles of taking something to be true or taking something to be the case, and episteme as a special kind of belief, for instance, knowledge equals to justified true belief, which is a standard version. This is the Atlantic or negative edge of our work, to argue for bracketing contemporary epistemological assumptions when making sense of Plato's epistemological projects. Challenging epistemological presuppositions at work in current Platonic scholarship clears the way for the explanatory and positive edge of Moss' work, which aims at interpreting Plato on his own terms, paying close attention to his intellectual environment and following the steps of the heirs of his approach to matters of knowledge, perception, and truth. In this vein, Moss insists on a much stronger continuity between Plato and his student Aristotle than many scholars would like to recognize. And we see this aspect play out in this paper with the connection between Aristotle's distinction of things gnorimon familiar to us and things gnorimon by nature, with Plato's cognition of perceptibles, i.e. sense perception in everyday reality, the shadows for the cave dwellers, and the cognition of forms or being, that is, the vision outside of the cave. Let me briefly summarize then her paper before moving forward to offer some remarks. At the outset, Moss spells out her interest in the question of what is cognition for Plato, and following from this, what draws together Plato's different epistemological kinds, these kinds of cognition, especially episteme and doxa, but also including eikasia, dianoia, and noesis, into a common category or genus. Without entering into too much detail, for Moss, Plato's epistemology is object-based. That is, human cognitive capacities are specified and determined according to the peculiar objects that fall within their scope to cognize. So each cognitive capacity, episteme and doxa, tracks a distinct category of objects. For this reason, Plato's epistemology turns out to be sharply distinct from contemporary epistemologists' position that deem knowledge as, by definition, knowledge of facts, knowledge of states of affairs, or knowledge of true propositions. As stated in the paper, I quote, episteme is best understood as a relation of good acquaintance with being, ultimate reality, where good acquaintance is to be understood on the model of the relation we bear to familiar people, end quote. Alternatively, as expressed in her book, episteme is cognition of being or a deep grasp of being. In contrast with episteme, doxa is to be understood as a defective, imperfect, and inferior form of cognition, owing to the qualities of the objects that it cognizes. Thus, doxa is rendered as cognition of what seems in Moss' book. But how are we to understand that the fact that doxa, qua knowledge of perceptual reality, falls within the same class as episteme, qua knowledge of ultimate reality, i.e. the first principles or the underlying causes that structure reality? Well, both involve a certain acquaintanceship, in Moss' term, with reality, a good acquaintanceship of familiarity. In the case of doxa, it is a shallow, misleading, and atheoretical acquaintance with reality that contents itself with the level of apparent phenomena. In the case of episteme, it is a deeper, penetrating, intellectual acquaintance with reality that searches after and examines the underlying causes of apparent everyday phenomena. Hence, the acquaintanceship model holds for both episteme and doxa, but in Plato's epistemological hierarchy, episteme counts as an intimate acquaintance with reality, while doxa amounts to a superficial and flawed acquaintance with it. In her argument, Moss tackles the Republic's dogs philosopher's analogy from 376a to c to explicate Plato's conception of knowledge as familiarity or well-acquaintanceship with certain objects of love and affection. As Moss puts it, when commenting subsequently on Republic 419a to b, so it's text 1 and 2 of the handout, I quote, and connecting text 1 and 2 of the handout, I quote, the goal of philosophical education is a special relation to certain objects, the forms. Wisdom is best understood as an objectual attitude, end quote, analogously as dogs' philosophical nature is manifesting their love for familiar folks. Next, Moss brings together Aristotle's accounts of the educational process with Plato's image of education and lack of education from the cave allegory to explain the idea of knowledge as acquaintanceship that progresses through philosophical paideia, from a shallow, low-level familiarity with unquestioned, given objects from perceptual reality, to a deeper familiarity with higher-level, extrasensory objects that form the ultimate structure of reality, the backbone of reality, the hidden backbone of reality. In doing this, she hints at an idea she more fully explores in her book, namely the epistemic principle of cognition of like by like, which we find already in Empedocles. Besides the fact already mentioned that each cognitive capacity tracks a distinct category of objects, each cognitive capacity also resembles its object in a certain manner. Thus, knowledge of the forms episteme is clear, pure, stable, and precise, because the forms are endowed with these very same properties: clarity, purity, stability, or maybe it is actually the reverse, because the forms have these properties of clarity, purity, stability, that the episteme, the cognition of them, are by the same token clear, pure, stable, and precise. Just making a correction here. On the contrary, knowledge of perceptual reality, dogs, is messy, vague, wavering, and inexact as a consequence of the properties of perceptual reality, which is the domain of becoming, in contradiction to the domain of being, the domain of forms. Given this, the common class to which cognitive capacities belong for Plato is identified and defended by Moss as familiarity with reality, reinforcing her book's thesis that Plato's epistemology is an object-based epistemology, with the epistemic principle of cognition of like by like operating through and through. With this short and I hope not too sketchy overview of Professor Moss' paper, I offer now some remarks to initiate our conversation with her. So the first one, and maybe you should ignore this first one because now with her presentation, you got a clear idea of your distinction, but I'm going to read it anyway. Despite your disclaimer that your acquaintance mode of knowledge in Plato is not to be taken in the technical sense of Bertrand Russell's knowledge by acquaintance, I cannot help but wonder if there isn't something deep in common between both notions, since you recognize that even if, quote, some knowledge may be proposition, end quote, it is not reducible to propositional knowledge or knowledge by description in Russell's term. Could you please then speak more about this connection, if perhaps think there is a more substantial affinity besides the lexical choice between Russell's knowledge by acquaintance and your understanding of Plato's epistemology? Or what are the more crucial differences between one and the other that make you distance yourself from Russell's account? And if I understood you correctly now with your presentation, you would distance from Russell in that acquaintanceship will be not just, it would be deeper, your notion of acquaintanceship would be deeper and fuller, and it can be expressed by proposition, even if it's not reduced by proposition. And also, I guess it has also something to, it is also related to your distinction between certainty and, well, acquaintanceship that you brought out in the end as the acquaintance of sense perception in Russell's case, and the certainty you have when you have acquaintance of sense data, and the well familiarity you can have with the forms. But you can address this question or not, since you just spoke very clearly in your presentation. So, second question, in accordance with your acquaintance mode of knowledge in Plato, would you think a Platonic philosopher can be well acquainted with a single form F, say beauty or justice, without being well acquainted with the whole intelligible domain of forms? In other words, do you think that Plato is a holist or atomist when it comes to the knowledge of the forms, episteme? So a question about atomism and holism in episteme. So third question, at the end of your paper, you claim that, quote, we can say that Plato's idea in the dog's passage is the one Aristotle will make explicit at the start of his metaphysics. Humans and dogs by nature desire to know. And quote, I wonder if this human desire for knowledge that you pick up from Aristotle and ascribe to Plato does not follow from a deeper and more substantial cause, namely our natural desire for the good, for our own good, as Socrates asserts in many of Plato's dialogues. Gorgeous, Protagoras, men, and so on. You can see the references. In this way, Plato's epistemological project would seem to be grounded on ethical concerns. What is the best form of life to be lived? and wrapped up in a metaphysical vista, as you so skillfully argued in your book. So how do you think that the desire for knowledge and the desire for the good are related in Plato? So how do they fit together? Which comes first? You can take this last question as an invitation for you to speak more about the interconnectedness between Plato's epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics. Final note, to Moss' mapping of Sophists in connection to knowledge in ancient sources, I would add only 2 more instances that come up in Socrates' criticism of writing from the Phaedrus at 277 C6 Saphes and 277 Saphenia, where Socrates declares that nothing clear and stable can be attached to written texts. Well, in this case, and for this reason, we have to be additionally thankful for Professor Moss, since we are fortunate enough to have her with us here in person to discuss so many ideas and arguments. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pedro. This was very insightful. So Professor Moss, Jessica Moss, if you'd like to respond to Pedro's commentary, you have the floor.
Great. Yeah, I'll try to be brief, and then if yeah, we can come back to things. So first of all, just thank you so much. I thought that was just great comments. I thought you did what commentators should do, which is summarize things more clearly than the speaker did sometimes. And I really appreciated you sort of taking the care to draw connections to my book that I didn't spell out. And then I also think the questions you raised are really interesting ones. Maybe I won't say, I'll just say one more thing about the first question about Russellian acquaintance, because I did say more. Maybe one way to bring it out, and this is something that other people have mentioned when they're talking now about objectual knowledge or connaissance as opposed to Russellian acquaintance. When I say I'm acquainted with a person, that's something that comes in degrees. So I can know them just a little, or I can get to know them better, and so on. Whereas Russellian acquaintance seems to be all or nothing. Now, maybe that's the wrong way to understand Russell, but that is how he's traditionally been understood. So that would be another way to bring out the difference there. That I think what Plato is thinking is something like you have it a little bit, but you want it more, and so on, rather than just you see it or you don't. So that is a quick response to that. The second question that you asked is the question about, could a Platonic philosopher be well acquainted with a single form without being well acquainted with the whole domain? That is a really interesting question, and I will just admit it's not something I've thought about very much before. So your question, I've had a kind of not very thought through sort of knee-jerk reaction against a kind of holistic reading of Plato. So there, I don't know if I have any good philosophical principles underlying this. It has sometimes seemed to me a bit wrong, but certainly he thinks you know, without knowledge of the form of the good, you're not going to really have the best kind of knowledge of the other forms. But maybe I'll just give the beginnings of an answer based on what I'm thinking of here. I think the thought would be what you really want is to be well acquainted with reality. And so reality is a whole, and the forms are connected to each other. Certainly they're connected, at least in the idea that the good gives the other forms their being. And so insofar as that's the case, you're not going to get really well acquainted with a single individual form without also being well acquainted with the form of the good. So that's at least a beginning of an answer. And I do think if we think of it, I mean, it would be weird for someone to say, you know, I really want to really get to know this one particular species of frog really well, but I'm really very uninterested in any other species of frog. You might think, well, there's something, if you're interested in frogs, aren't you kind of interested in frogs? So maybe the notion, I can see where you might think, if we're thinking of knowledge on the model of good acquaintance rather on the knowledge of, on the model of certainty, then maybe that kind of invites a holism. So I'm very open to that possibility. I think it's really interesting. And then finally, you say, I wonder if this human desire for knowledge doesn't follow from a deeper, more substantial cause, namely our natural desire for the good. So yes, absolutely. So in the last chapter of my book on Plato's epistemology, I try to locate Plato's epistemological categories within his ethical concerns. And the big picture being, sorry, I know you know this, Pedro, but just to summarize briefly, the big picture being, you know, we all want what's good. If it turns out that's what's really good, unlike, say, maybe in the Socratic dialogues, what's good is virtue, maybe, it turns out what's really good is the forms, these strange entities, then what we want for our own lives is to somehow be connected to them, to somehow be in contact with them. And given the kind of things the forms are, you know, you can't eat them. You can sort of metaphorically, as he says in that passage that I quoted, metaphorically, you can have intercourse with them, but really what you can do with them is you can know them. So I guess that, so I certainly think that he thinks that knowledge is valuable insofar as it puts us in contact with the good. So I think that would be a natural fit with the idea, and I hadn't kind of made this explicit to myself at all, so thanks for the question, but that our desire for knowledge, or for episteme or Sophia, stems from our desire for contact with the good. And thinking of it on the model of knowledge, on the model of good acquaintance, yeah, you know, if you love the forms and you want to be connected to the forms, it's like you want to get to know them. You want to get with them mentally, because that's the way you can get with them. So I think that's a very nice, sorry, I like that way of thinking very much. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jessica. If anybody wants to ask a question, I'd ask them to please raise their hands virtually on Zoom. Since nobody has done that yet, I'm going to start. So thank you very much for this very, sorry, Thomas and Carolina, I guess I jumped the line. Thank you very much for this very interesting talk, Jessica. So I have two questions which are somehow in some manner interrelated. The first is, as you mentioned now in trying to differentiate your account of knowledge by acquaintance with that of Brussels, the knowledge by acquaintance that you attribute to Plato goes in a sort of a scale, right? You get closer and closer to the knowledge of the forms. But something that Andrea Nightingale remarks interestingly in her latest book is that Plato often uses the language of epiphany when talking about the knowledge of the forms. Knowledge of the forms comes sort of all at once. And even in the analogy of the cave, of course, the philosopher, he sees the sun all at once. It's something that sort of hits him, and then he knows, right? So I was wondering how that you would incorporate that sort of vocabulary into your account, and just something that's sort of related to that, but also sort of goes in the other direction. I was wondering in what sense or not, because something with which Plato seems to be particularly concerned within the Phaedrus at least, is the matter of forgetting, right? The philosopher needs to constantly go to the forms again and again in order to reacquaint himself with the forms, right? And I was thinking how that squares with the way that you interpret knowledge by acquaintance in Plato, because I mean, at least in the case of knowing a person, can you forget that you know, once you get to know a person, can you forget that knowledge by acquaintance of the person? I mean, not taking into consideration the possibility that that person changes, of course, but is that forgetting something that you know by acquaintance something that is possible? So those would be my two questions.
Great. Those are really interesting questions. So to start with the first one about approximation. So I think these questions are just orthogonal. I don't think that they have to go in steps. So you might think, look, there's some things that come in degrees in the sense that I can have more of it than somebody else. So, and maybe that some of those things tend to go gradually. So for example, height, you know, you get taller, you don't suddenly get taller. You know, one person can have more height than another person, but they don't suddenly acquire it. On the other hand, what about being richer or something, right? So being richer also comes in degrees, or sorry, being rich comes in degrees. One person is richer than another, but you can suddenly gain money or suddenly lose money. So I don't think the fact that something comes in degrees has to mean that its acquisition has to be gradual. I'm not sure what I think of the sudden acquisition stuff. I mean, it's an interesting view. I'm not sure I agree with it, but at least, yeah, I don't think that it's necessarily going to conflict with this view at all. Tell me more about the Phaedrus and the forgetting. So you think that, sorry, what are you thinking of here?
So like if you take the story in the Paranode in which the souls have to leave their home, go to the forms so that they can feed off the forms, and then they go back, and that's something that they have to do constantly in order to keep themselves up there, right?
And is it, so I'm actually not remembering this. Is the implication that it's embodiment that makes us forget, like we get in the Phaedo, or is it? So
these are not embodied souls in the Phaedrus that are forgetting, right? Their distance from the forms, it's what's causing the forgetfulness.
So even in the disembodied, that's very interesting. And I want to think about that more. But in principle, I don't see why it should be a bad fit, right? So to recall someone, I mean, you can get to know somebody pretty well, and then you forget them. You have to become reacquainted with them. I don't know that it would be any different. yeah, I'm not seeing that this model of knowledge, rather than say the certainty model of knowledge, would particularly cut either way on that. But yeah, maybe it does seem like if you really know it well, then you really know it well. That's a very interesting one. I'll think on that. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Thomas?
Yes, hi, thanks. Thank you, Jessica. Very interesting talk. Many questions arise, but I have one sort of a small question on maybe on philosophical dogs point of view. And one of the interesting things, especially the commentator brought up the connection between desire for the good and desire for knowledge, and for desire for, and it is not knowledge itself being a kind of familiarity. But one thing that's always struck me about the dogs passage is the way Socrates goes out of his way to say they are familiar with something, whether it's been good to them or not.
Yeah.
It's a separation between familiarity and good. And in other dialogues, you get the idea. Do you think something good is good because it's familiar, or is it good to you because is it familiar to you because it's good? So I'm just wondering, why do you think? I mean, is that significant for your? I haven't really thought it through. Is that significant for your analysis of knowledge and cognitive states as a kind of familiarity, when familiarity seems to be in some cases divorced from the good?
Nice. That's a great question. And I wish that I had, but instead I will say, if you don't mind, I will in the future add this to the list. So if you look back on the handout, I had these kind of sham and lesser things at the end, contrasting dogs and philosophers. So that was towards the end of the handout. I would want to add to that sham versus lesser goodness, or sorry, sham or lesser goodness of object. I'm typing that out as we speak. So I think the idea would be, look, the philosophers love the forms. You know, to know the forms is to love them. Why? Well, because the forms really are really, really good. But the thing that we see at these low levels, that's kind of an imitation of this, is you kind of think something is good. You treat something as good just because you're familiar with it. So just like I was saying the dog's love for the people they know is a kind of sham or lesser kind of love. It seems like it might be the same with the goodness. Aristotle says something very similar in the Protrepticus, by the way. He says we call people philoi. We love them. We think they're friends just because they're gnorimoi. And so you might think, look, so great is our attachment to knowing things, to being familiar with things, that even if we have a little bit of it towards something, we kind of project onto that thing the value of the knowledge that we have. But of course, the way it's really supposed to go is, and this is getting back exactly to Pedro's question about our desire for good, is that there are things which are really good. Those are the same things which you can really get to know. So that's how it ought to be.
Good.
The
Thanks.
kind of ideal case. Yeah. Thank you. Good. And nice to see you.
Carolina?
Hi, thanks. That was very interesting. I appreciate that. So my comment is on the general intention of finding a class in which all this pathemata and dynamis fit in. Well, for two comments on that. First is, I don't think that Okeos is a good candidate for it. Okeos is a very important term in Socratic literature as a whole. And so we can think about the Lysis too, if you think about Plato. And in the Republic, it is a very central concept to justice. So it's not wisdom that is familiarity, it's justice that is oikeiopragia. So to make things oikeia. So, and we have like this much broader notion of oikeios that, you know, in the end, you get this kind of big notion that is vague, as you complained about dynamis and pathemata. Okay, oikeios is also very big. And I noticed that when you were talking about this, it says, it's an attitude of, it's a cognitive objectual attitude towards what is familiar. So in the end, you were caught in this kind of cognition description of what familiarity is. And we can, of course, think that familiarity involves other relations that are not cognitive. So then we're back to gnotismos and gnome and gnosis. And I think that we have pretty much good textual evidence about gnome and gnosis being the word that is connecting to this, especially in 476d, 477a, where he is trying to introduce the distinction between doxa and episteme, and he say there is gnostos, pantelos gnostos, and that, so you have this, and that's the idea. So what I'm trying to suggest is that do we need a class for this? Because when we're talking about degrees, and I think you're committed to the notion of degrees, we are talking about opposites. So all we need, it seems to me, is the concept of gnosis or gnome, that is textual, and then agnoia, and then we have things. So we don't need this kind of a kind and difference system, as I think you were trying to do, so it's a whole kind. But if we're talking about degrees, we just need two opposites in the extreme, and we find something in between. So thank you very much.
Great. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff there. So maybe I'll start with the idea of the oikeos, familiarity. So I have to admit, I wasn't actually, in using the English word familiarity, I wasn't actually meaning to be translating the Greek word oikeos, but I certainly see the connection there, right? I was thinking of this as primarily as a mental or cognitive kind of relation. So I said familiarity, or maybe good acquaintance is a better translation of it, but it does seem like it's a relation you bear to things that are oikeon to you, that are familiar or akin to you. And then the question is, are they so in this kind of lesser way that you've been exposed to them, or are they in this deeper way where there's a kind of natural fit with them, and so on. So, but yes, I guess I do think that knowledge turns out to be something that is based on a relationship of oikeotes, of connection between these, but I didn't mean to just be saying it is familiarity, right? That would be that's too broad a category. Good. Then, and that connects to your second question, why look for a class? Why not just go for the opposites and what's in between? I guess just to put it really flat-footedly, why is doxa in between, right? So I can say I have episteme, and then I have agnoia, which is the opposite of it. And then, what if someone says, oh, I think that love is in between those two, or I think that desire is in between those two, or I think that eating is in between those two, or something. Saying, no, the thing that's in between those two is doxa. So doxa must be somehow similar to episteme. It must be on a continuum with it. And he does, the degrees talk is very much there with the pantelos and the udamos, as you were saying, but it's also there when he talks about doxa being less clear than episteme, but clearer than agnoia, and these other kinds of comparatives that we get. So it's clear that he thinks doxa, it has properties in common with episteme, but it has them to a lesser degree. It's less clear, it's less true, it's less stable, it's less precise we get elsewhere. So I see the value of saying there's the good thing and there's its opposite and there's what's in between, but I still think we need to say, well, why is this the relevant, I want to say category again. Why is this the thing that gets to be in between those? What does it have that gives it a place on that line at all? Does that satisfy? Mm-hmm. Or maybe, I don't know, address at least?
Yes, sure. I agree, but I was just suggesting that you could take gnosis as, you say, you find in Aristotle, and you find later on Plotinus, gnosis as cognition, but it also describes the extreme. So, you mean, as we say, how hard something is, the hardness of something. The hardness of something could be the extreme of being hard, but it could be something in between, and it is connected because it's connected to cognition. That's the idea. Thank you so much.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, so Jill, please.
Yes, thank you. I thought my point was going to be sort of off the wall, but it follows in a way from Carolina's point. Pardon me. I didn't think that you were using familiarity as a translation of oikeos, but I wanted to give 3 cheers for familiarity as the name you choose for this kind of cognition. And for a couple of reasons that have really already come out in your reply to Carolina. And that is, at the basis of our word familiar is family. And so there's a way in which that sort of does capture this akinness. And what I liked about that was that it then captures, we're like those in our family in a very specific way. And I thought it really captured the way in which the soul of the philosopher becomes more and more like, or is more and more ordered like reality as the philosopher comes to know the realities, become acquainted with them better. So that was it, just a brief comment to say 3 cheers for familiarity as a good word to capture what you're getting at. And thank you, it was really an illuminating paper on a lot of points. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Okay, so Salsa, please.
Okay, my first question would be pretty much like Thomas' question, because I was going to mention the refutation of the Simonides version of justice, that it is doing good for our friends, and then Socrates makes the same thing. We have a lot of friends that we think they are good, but they are bad. So yeah, I guess the answer already answers my question. So I'm going to jump to the second one, which is how does this general approach fits with at least with the Socratic enterprise that seems to be a little more negative? That is, things that we think we have familiarity with, and in fact we do not have. So this seems to be the push for learning or for searching for knowledge. So how this view would fit with that?
Just to say that question a little bit more. I'm not quite sure I got it. The question is, can you just say the second question again? I'm not sure I got it.
Because if you frame these degrees as increasing the level of familiarity that you have with something, it seems that learning is it's more positive based attitude, but in Socrates it seems to be very negative. So it seems things that we think we are familiar, the general thinks he's very familiar with courage and he should recognize that he doesn't. And even in Plato, desire and love, they are lacking it. It's a great part of it. So yeah.
Good. Okay, I understand.
Negative aspect.
Good. Now that's a good question. So I guess I want to answer sort of by analogy with what I said about the prisoners in the cave, and also by analogy, a comparison that I draw in my book between people who sort of have doxa, ordinary people who think they know the answer to questions like what is virtue because they point to a virtuous action. Analogy between those and people that Aristotle would describe as having empiria, experience. So the thought in both cases would be, look, if you're someone who you think you know what virtue is because you're good at identifying this action as virtuous and that action is not virtuous, you're good at that in the sense that it's like the prisoners in the cave, it fits with how society does it. You're kind of a master of the conventions and so on. What Socrates would want to come and say is like, look, that's like being an expert at identifying shadows. There's really not much there. There isn't a robust subject matter here. It's this kind of shadowy subject matter. And so your acquaintance with it, your familiarity with it is not going to be very deep and it's not going to be very full. Come away from that instead. And in fact, I can show this to you by showing that there's all these problems with it. Come away from that and instead come to this kind of higher learning. So I was thinking of analogies and I thought they would all be offensive to somebody, but I was thinking about, what do you do if, say, your kid goes off to college and they come home and they say, I'm majoring in X. You can fill in the blank for whatever you might think. And you think like, that's just a waste of your education. There's just not that much there to get to know. You're an intellectual person. You want to have this kind of knowledge of reality. You want to get to know things. And if you're studying whatever you want to put, I know some parents would think film studies, and some people might, some people would think philosophy, probably, right? But whatever it is, where you might just think like, this is kind of a bogus sham subject. There's just not much there that you're going to get satisfied with. I think Socrates would say similarly with, if you're confining yourself to these kind of easy but cheap particular examples of things, or conventional aspects of things, conventional justice, for example. So you think you're wise, Euthyphro, because you can point to this action and say it's pious and some people will follow you, but that's not real wisdom. Real wisdom is if you got to know the form. Thumbs up? Okay.
Sorry, go ahead, Jessica.
No,
Okay.
that's good.
So since we started a little bit late, there's still time for a couple more questions. So if anyone else wants to ask questions, please feel free to raise your hand. So I have another point. I might be way off here, but in your way of reading the question of the philosophical dogs, if I understood you correctly, you mean that Socrates is not proposing an analogy, right? That the familiarity that a dog will have with its owners is the same kind of familiarity a person would have with the forms, even if a familiarity with the forms can be much deeper, but the difference is in degree and not in kind, right? So am I right to say then that you be committing Plato to an opinion on animal reason, which is animals' reasoning would be of the same kind as human reasoning, just in a different degree?
Okay, nice question. Okay, so first of all, to say, I think I probably hedged a little bit in the paper and in the presentation between saying, yeah, same in kind. On the one hand, what you're proposing, same in kind, but just to a lesser degree. And on the other hand, what I was saying at the end, maybe it's not just lesser, maybe it's sham or imitation, right? So fake gold isn't just less than real gold, it's fake. It's an imitation, it's not the same thing. So I think in the end, that's probably the way that I would want to go and say, the dog doesn't really have good acquaintance with the people that it knows, but it has something that's valuable insofar as it's an imitation of real good acquaintance, and real good acquaintance is what philosophers have with the forms. Okay, so that's the first part. Then what's the bearing on the question of animal reasoning? I mean, no, even if I said it was just lesser in degree, it wouldn't have to be reasoning. So think of Aristotle as a model. There's a nice passage from Generation of Animals where he says that gnosis is the function of all animals. And he says, because even perception is gnosis of a kind. It's little, but compared with being like not having it at all, like compared to being a plant, it's still pretty great. So he's not saying that perception is logismos or nous or any of those things up there. He's saying it is a lesser version of what those things are, a lesser degree of what those things are. So that there's something, they belong, perception and intellect for Aristotle are going to belong to a common kind. And what I'm suggesting for Plato is, we can see what people have down at the bottom, or the prisoners in the cave, as belonging either literally to a common kind or the kind that's defined by genuine plus imitations. In this way.
Can I just push back just a little bit? Because at the same time, in this same passage or right afterwards, the capacity to have familiarity is taken by Socrates as an indication that someone can become a guardian and after that a philosopher, right? So it's not just that it's a lesser kind of cognition, but it also shows promise for a capacity to have a greater kind of cognition. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's a counter in any way. Maybe it's not.
Sorry, so you're saying we're looking at the dogs because they're supposed to be a model that someone could be philosophical, a learning loving person. Yeah, but he's not literally saying we should choose dogs, right? But he's saying, I think what he's saying there is you want to find someone who is a natural lover of learning or lover of wisdom. And a sign that someone might be a lover of learning or wisdom is that, like a dog, they would be kind of attached to the things that they know. But look, if I see you showing a great love for fake gold, then this is very connected to my answer to the previous question, I might come to you and say, look, I can see that what you really want is gold, and this thing you're looking at is not real gold. So let me sort of redirect that love of yours. But if I see that you're not even interested in fake gold, then maybe I'm just thinking you're not a gold loving type, and I'm not going to try to get you interested. So I think that's how it would go.
Right. Thank you. Okay, so we have time for a quick last one. So Celso, please.
This is just a half-baked thinking, but I was thinking that so it is impossible to teach acquaintance, right?
Mhm.
This is interesting for the case of the forms, but you can teach the results that you have when you had the acquaintance. So this is maybe it is good when a mathematic has acquaintance with an abstract object and see the relations, he will not be able to teach the acquaintance, but he's going to be able to teach the results of the acquaintance. And by seeing the results of the acquaintances, the students, they may have the acquaintance. I'm just thinking out loud.
I'm not sure. Yeah. So, I mean, this might be another way in which this is going to be different from Russellian acquaintance, right? I can't make you directly acquainted with a color by talking to you about the color. But on the other hand, what is teaching? I don't know if we take the Meno kind of idea of teaching as sort of guiding you through recollection, then maybe the idea is, I've got to know the form pretty well. And then if you're a student, maybe I can get you to have the kind of thoughts that are going to help you get to know it really well. But I'm not I don't know. I think that the question of what teaching is in Plato is a complicated enough question. I wouldn't say it's something you can give by just telling somebody the results, right? But yeah, maybe the idea would be thinking of it on the model of good acquaintance maybe encourages the thought that a lot of people have very reasonably had about Plato, which is he thinks real knowledge involves doing your own intellectual work. You have to get to know the thing yourself. And so whether that's by, with the help of some kind of teaching and your own intellectual effort, or whether you're relying on these kind of quasi-visual, you behold the forms all of a sudden or something like that, at least it's going to have to be something. You're going to have to be in a relation of the same kind that your teacher was to this object. Sorry, that's a bit vague, but yeah, interesting question, but we need to think a lot more about maybe you are thinking a lot more about teaching, but yeah, we need a better account of what teaching is to see how it's going to work in Plato. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jessica. Unfortunately, this is the end of the Q&A.
Then I'll just speak up to say thank you so much, and this was a really helpful discussion for me. And thanks again to Pedro for really great comments.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Pedro, for the commentary. So we're heading now to our last speaker of the day. This is also of the symposium, unfortunately. This is Professor Marco Zingano. He'll receive a commentary by Luiz Fernando. Professor Marco Zingano is full professor at the University of São Paulo. His research interests are mainly in ancient philosophy, particularly in ethics and metaphysics. He has published books such as As Virtudes Morais, Estudos de Ética Antiga, in English, Moral Virtues, Essays on Ancient Ethics. And he's also the editor of Sobre a Ética Nicomacheia de Aristóteles, or Essays on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and also Sobre a Metafísica de Aristóteles, Essays on Aristotle's Metaphysics, both of which were published by Odysseus. He also recently translated and wrote a commentary and introduction to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics 1.13 until 13.5. He'll be giving a lecture called Troublemakers. And just before you start, let me just introduce the commentator. The commentator to Marco Zingano's paper will be Luiz Fernando Pereira Aguiar. He received a BA in the social sciences at University of São Paulo and an MA in philosophy also at the University of São Paulo. And now he is a PhD student in philosophy at the University of São Paulo, where he is researching the medieval reception of Aristotle. So, Professor Marco Zingano, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Antonio. Well, it's an honor to give a talk in these conferences. And it's a quite challenging task to be the last one, especially speaking after Jessica. So I'm quite afraid I will disappoint you. But I try to make some sense of what I call the troublemakers. I suppose you are all curious about who are these guys. They are not guys, they are problems, concepts, that are troublemakers. So I read my paper. I hope it will take about 30, 35 minutes, and then we can go on for the discussion. So I'll begin with my paper. This is easier for me than just speak. Also, there's the handout on screen, right? So I'd like to begin this talk by recalling a familiar scenario. And this is the well-known dispute between Plato and Aristotle over the ontological status of that which is predicated not homonymously of a plurality of things, so as to reveal a common and unique nature these items share. I'm referring here to certain terms, and you set aside another use of universals. Well, this is controversial, but I try to keep this idea of some universals that are grasping the nature of things as sort of terms. According to Plato, this common nature is a form that exists separately and is fully what it is, while the items it is predicated of are only likenesses of it. And according to Aristotle, all that is shown by this sort of predication is that there is a common predicate of the items universally said of them. The form that displays the meaning of this sort of universals exhibits what it is of these things, but cannot exist separately of them. Well, this is quite familiar, and I am giving you two passages to illustrate them in the handouts, passage 1 and 2. I won't read them, you know them quite well. Just look at the last sentence of Aristotle's passage that comes from the Posterior's Analytics, 1:11, and then Aristotle is just saying that, look, all that we need, that there must be some one and the same thing, to autor eniplion enai me homonymon, there must be someone and the same thing, not homonymous, holding of several cases, and this is Aristotle's notion of universal. Well, there are many details in both passages I cannot deal with here. Let me only point out that as regards Plato's passage, the one that comes from the last book of the Republic, there is some sort of scent of nominalism, but I think it dwindles as soon as one adds to that passage the non-homonymy requirement and takes the final part, the things to which we apply the same name as a non-defined relative clause. And I think the basic meaning is that for each multiplicity of sensible things that share a common nature, Plato is postulate a unique form, and they all the items that share this form partake the same name. And this is what Plato calls the usual procedure. What they often does, ectes eiotias method, that Plato has Socrates remind Glaucon of, that is, to postulate a form for each well-constructed multiplicity. And you have also connections with what is called in the academy the one over many argument, Henopiton, Polon. If you look at Aristotle's passage, you see that Aristotle is fiercely arguing against forms as separate entities, and this is well known. Now, there are many aspects of these discussions that are crucial for a correct grasp of natural kinds, and there is a vast literature dedicated to them. I want to focus on a rather neglected aspect, which I call troublemakers, not people, such as the sophists, who are troublemakers indeed, but concepts and notions that do not fit the pattern of universality, despite the fact that they are well-formed notions and do capture realities, if I may use this word. So the idea, what I would like to discuss here is, of course, the discussion about the status of the universals between Plato and Aristotle is quite important, but I want to focus on another point. There are some notions that escape, they do not fit the pattern of universality, but they are well-formed notions. And these are the notions I'm calling here troublemakers. In other words, I call them the non-generic unities. I mean, by these conceptual unities that do not follow, do not fit the pattern of universals. They, to them, there is not a genus or genera that correspond to them. That there are such non-generic unities is evident from Aristotle's texts. Think, for instance, of being, which is not a genus, but is legitimately said as being in 10 categories, and these categories are distinct from one another and cannot be reduced to one of them or to something over and above them. Another non-generic unity is good, which is also set in as many categories as being. And I suspect that change, kinesis, is another non-generic unity, for it is said in 4 categories: substance, quality, quantity, and where. And so if it is said in more than one category, it seems to be a sign that it's a non-generic unity. In fact, when we read Aristotle, there are loads of them. But these 3 cases, being, good, and change, suffice to show that not only there are such notions, but also that they are very important, for they form the basis on which to ground a scientific discourse, since being is the main notion of first philosophy, change is central to second philosophy, and good is the leading notion of ethics. And well, it's a fascinating topic to study how Aristotle came to realize their central role and how he coped with the problem of dealing with such non-generic unities. For instance, one may ask, does Aristotle work with only one pattern for all non-generic unities? Or are there different patterns? And if the latter, which are these patterns and how they are classified? Well, I set all these questions aside, however fascinating they are. Aristotle displays much ingenuity in devising them, but what I want to show here is that he was not going down untrodden paths, quite the opposite. I want to show that the problem of non-generic unities was a topic of research in Plato's academy, and that Plato reflects a lot on their status. So this is my main idea, is just to show that something that is crucial for Aristotle's mindset. I mean, having these non-generic unities as central notions in order to organize the scientific discourse. This is something that was already being discussed in the late years of Plato in the academy. Now, let me just make 2 observations to start with. The first one is this, is that I will be speaking of non-generic unities, which are some sort of associate homonymies, attenuated homonymies. There are different ways to refer to them. What they are not is that they are not accidental homonymies. So they are sort of a homonymy, but it is not accidental homonymy. I will not speak of associated homonymy because this is connected with one idea that there is just one pattern, which is exemplified by the pros-hen structure. The idea is that there are different ways of being there are different patterns for non-generic unities, but this is not the point I want to discuss here. I just want to make it clear that I will be speaking of homonymy, but I'm not speaking of accidental homonymy, but some sort of homonymy in which there is some connection between the meanings that overlap somehow. They do, but do not coincide as it is the case in synonymy. And my second point is this: there is a quite easy method or way to identify or to pinpoint these troublemakers. It's just to look at our problems as translators. Think of pathos, for instance, when you have to translate it either as emotion or as an affection, but these two notions are quite distinct. And so this is for us, but not for Plato or for Aristotle. This is for us a sign that there is some problem in this, the notion, in the very notion of pathos, and you have to see quite have to be very careful to see what is going on in the notion, the very notion of pathos, whether there are two distinct notions or there is just one, and how this unity is obtained. In topics, Aristotle provides us with several rules to detect cases of non-generic unities, but I will leave this aside. I just mentioned one passage of the topics, which is connected with a problem in the way we can conceive of Sophrosine or Aphrosine as unique notions, but I'm not interested in developing this point. So the idea is this. I will propose for consideration two notions in Plato. So Sophrosine is one of them, and the second one is eros or love. And at the end of this paper, I make some general comments on Plato's attitude towards these two notions. And in a nutshell, the main outcome is this: the Sophrosine is for Plato a unique notion, even though we can have good reasons to dispute this idea. But you see that the notion of eros is much more difficult, it's trickier to put into the same notion, to offer just the same definition of eros. And so eros, love, will enable me to go in the direction of this new realm, the domain of what I'm calling here the troublemakers, these non-generic unities. And these notions will not be developed by Plato himself, but will be something very important for Aristotle. No, so the first part is the meaning of Sophrosine. So Sophrosine is either temperance or self-control on the one hand, or sound mind, good sense on the other. Or else, in what I think is a desperate move to find a common sense, one can try to translate it as mood, as discipline. These two meanings, self-control or temperance on the one hand, and sound mind and good sense on the other, seem split into two quite different domains: practical reasoning and theoretical reasoning. And now my question is, well, how does Plato examine this notion? Does he think that it is one and the same notion that is captures both, has two aspects, the practical and the intellectual one, or there are two notions involved here? And if there are two, how they are connected? So I'm going first to take a look at the unity of virtues in Protagoras. And the argument Socrates puts forward can be reconstructed in different ways, basically either as a thesis of reciprocity, this is Plasto's biconditionality reading, or as a thesis of identity, in the sense that all virtues are one and same nature, namely knowledge. I'm not interested in determining which one is the correct reading. I want to focus on the second argument, which is marshaled to back up Plato's thesis, whatever it is. This is the argument which runs from 332A4 to 333B5, the last sentence of which is the conclusion framed as a question, according to which the argument has shown that Sophrosini and wisdom, Sophia or episteme, are the same. What is most interesting in this argument is the way Plato has Socrates argue for the identity between Sophrosini and Sophia. And the argument sorry, I'm looking at a black screen, but I suppose everything is going on correctly, right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Okay, excellent. So I was a bit afraid of speaking to a screen all alone. Okay, so the argument is this. This is the second argument Plato has Socrates perform in order to prove that all virtues are one and the same. And the argument works with the contrary of Sophrosini, to wit, Aphrosini. So the idea is to show that Sophrosini and Sophia are the same. And the argument works with the contrary of Sophrosini, that is Aphrosini. Socrates begins by making Protagoras agree. For making agree that first, wisdom, Sophia, is the contrary of Aphrosini. As Protagoras agrees to the point, Socrates moves on and shows that, second point, Aphrosini has also as contrary Sophrosini, now taking the sense of temperance or self-control. Therefore, Aphrosini has two contraries, wisdom and temperance, Sophia and Sophrosini. Granted that, Socrates makes a new move, the third point, each thing has only one contrary, and Protagoras cannot but nod to this thesis. This is, so in fact, Protagoras cannot but nod that each thing has only one contrary, and this is because this is a central tenet of ancient dialectic, provided, of course, we are talking about things not homonymously, but if you are speaking of some notion not homonymously, it cannot but have just one contrary. Plato then has Socrates construe a dilemma, for if Protagoras holds that wisdom and temperance are not the same, but both of them are contrary to Aphrosini, and one thing cannot but have one contrary, Protagoras seems to hold an inconsistent set of four theses, which are my point 3 on page 1 of the handout. The theses are 1, wisdom is the contrary of Aphrosini. 2, temperance or self-control is the contrary of Aphrosini. Thesis 3, each single thing has only one contrary. And thesis 4, wisdom is different from temperance. So this seems to be inconsistent, an inconsistent set of theses. Now, as the dialogue puts it, Protagoras drops 4 and agrees very reluctantly that temperance and wisdom are the same, denying thesis 4. But must he concede the point, even though reluctantly? In topics 115, Aristotle gives us different devices to detect whether a term is used in many ways. The first instruction Aristotle provides us with is particularly opposite to our point. And I would like to read this passage in the topics 115. It is on page 1 of the handout. It's my item 4. It's a bit long, but it's worth reading it throughout. So I read this text. This is not my translation. This is Pickett's Cambridge translation. So the text reads as such. I quote, first, says Aristotle, look and see if its contrary is used in many ways, whether discrepancy between them be of kind or one of names. For in some cases, a difference is at once displayed even in the names. For instance, the contrary of sharp in the case of a sound flat, while in the case of a body, it is dull. Clearly, then, the contrary of sharp is used in many ways, and if so, so also sharp. For corresponding to each of the formal terms, the contrary will be different. For sharp will not be the same when contrary to dull and to flat, though sharp is the contrary of each. Again, that in the case of a sound has sharp as its contrary, but in the case of a bird, raised, so that it is used in many ways, inasmuch as its contrary also is so used. Likewise, fine as applied to an animal has ugly as its contrary, but as applied to a house, mean. So that fine is homonymous. This is end of quotation. So in the light of this instruction, Protagoras would have simply replied as follows. Since each single thing has only one contrary, and wisdom is different from temperance, this was the thesis Protagoras was arguing for, then wisdom is the contrary of Afrosini in one meaning of it, and temperance is the contrary of Afrosini in a second and different meaning of it. This is quite simple to say. Well, the fact that both have Afrosini as contrary does not imply that wisdom and temperance are the same. It's just that they have Afrosini as contrary in different senses. So now Aristotle reports in topics many rules that were in practice in academic discussions. It is very likely that this one was one of them, and Plato was obviously aware of it. Therefore, one might wonder what is going on here. Is Plato trying to show that Protagoras, the character, is not capable of applying so simple a rule, thus insinuating that Protagoras, the philosopher, was not that smart? Is Plato unaware of the unfair move he has Socrates do? Does Socrates make an unfair move intentionally, meaning to play on Protagoras the same sort of trick sophists so often play on other people? Or is Plato obliquely addressing to his readers who are sensitive to understand that the argument can be disposed of, and this is why Protagoras only considers it very reluctantly, but considers it nonetheless? Fortunately, we do not need to enter Plato's mind to decide which way to go. As a matter of fact, Plato is dead serious. For him, Sophrosini has only one meaning, and consequently, its contrary, Afrosini, cannot but have one single meaning. Plato makes this pretty clear when he underscores that Afrosini is a single thing. This is said in 333b2, Heni onti. It's one thing, a single thing. And therefore, if there has two contraries, these contraries cannot but refer to one and the same thing. So there is no unfair move, at least according to Plato, and Socrates is not playing a trick on Protagoras. Socrates is honestly arguing that given that Afrosini has only one sense, their contraries, temperance and wisdom, must be identical to one another. After all, Plato does believe that Sophrosini and its contrary, Afrosini, have each one single sense only. Well, I think the same lesson can be learned from the Charmides, but I will not discuss this text, the Charmides dialogue. But I think the same thing is going on there. You have two characters, each one defending Charmides first, the idea of Sophrosini as self-control, and then Critias going on the other direction, discussing Sophrosini in terms of knowledge or, well, self-knowledge, which complicates things a bit, but basically you have the two notions of temperance and knowledge connected in the same notion, but correctly being referred to by that same term. So, leaving aside the comments, the dialogue, So I think we can say that Aristotle's analysis of these notions makes it plain that for him, for Aristotle, Plato is wrong. And the test of different contraries suffices to show that Plato's Sophrosine is not a well-formed notion, because Plato's Sophrosine unduly collects together two distinct notions, the moral virtue of temperance and the intellectual virtue of soundness of mind. Plato's stance that Sophrosine necessarily has a cognitive component is part and parcel of his program of reducing all virtues to knowledge. The lines that precede the passage quoted above from Topics, Aristotle alludes to the inexorable collapse of this program. Seems good, he said in many ways, and illustrates his point with courage and justice, two of Plato's cardinal virtues. So cardinal virtues, Sophrosine is also one of these cardinal virtues, which are different ways in which good is said, thereby entail that they cannot be unified as Plato meant them to be. It seems to bid farewell to Plato's unity of virtues, as the passage signals that the arguments Plato marshals to this effect in Protagoras will not succeed. And as a result, Plato's arguments about the identity between wisdom and temperance by means of the analysis of Afrosine as the single contrary of Sophrosine in both senses is also to be rejected. As a matter of fact, Aristotle does not confront Plato directly on the score of Sophrosine. He simply takes the notion of Sophrosine as a moral virtue, more specifically this moral virtue that is concerned with pleasure, connected to two senses, touch and taste, and leaves aside and attempts to define it through intellectual features. It's quite interesting to see that Aristotle echoes in Nicomachean Ethics 5 Plato's etymology of Sophrosine. Sophrosine is that which solves, preserves, furnaces. But Aristotle can do this precisely because Aristotelian furnaces moral wisdom and not knowledge in general, as it is in Plato. And moral wisdom requires two conditions to be the case: the correct determination of the end and the right reasoning about the ends. According to Aristotelian understanding of furnaces as moral wisdom, Sophrosine helps secure the correct apprehension of the correct determination of the end, apprehension of the end, and in this way it saves the furnaces. However, Plato proposed the same etymology in Cratylus, that which suffers. However, when Plato proposed the Platonic sense of knowledge, when Plato proposed the same etymology in Cratylus, meaning that which Sophrosine is the savor of is furnaces in the Platonic sense of knowledge in general. So they both can have the same and play with the same etymology, but the senses are quite different because they are ascribing the furnaces different meanings. Well, the lesson I think to keep in mind is this. There is a unitary meaning of Sophrosine in Plato, and this unitary meaning has a role to play in Plato's philosophy, but Aristotle rejects it by abandoning any attempt to find this common meaning. Of course, common language conveys both meanings, and Plato wants to keep them connected as if there were a core meaning to both senses. But Aristotle restricts its philosophical sense to that of moderation and is quite happy with this. So now I go to my second part, which is the notion of love and the erotic urge. And why I'm doing this? I'm doing this because of this. The notion of Sophrosine proves to be a false starter. Plato takes it to have a unitary meaning. I suspect that Plato is wrong and Aristotle is correct in setting them apart, these two meanings. But the problem is that the discussion about whether there is a common meaning of Sophrosine, and Plato is right in proposing that this is a universal of a Sophrosine, that you can define it as any other universal terms, does not make it emerge the problem that I'm looking for, which is the problem when you have a notion with two different meanings. Aristotle, I think, correctly understands that Sophrosine has two different meanings, but these two different meanings are separate meanings, so that you should say that for Aristotle, Sophrosine is some sort of, in the common language, is a sort of accidental homonymy. It either refers to self-control or to soundness of mind. So because Plato thinks there is a core meaning for them, and this is one and same meaning for both of these uses, the Sophrosine is a quite interesting case when you read Plato and Aristotle, but does not, it's a false starter for Plato in the sense that he does not believe that it has two meanings, it has just one. So I think a more promising candidate for what I'm looking for seems to be eros, often translated as love, and correctly so in many contexts, provided one bears in mind that it is inseparable from sexual desire. Plato devotes a dialogue specifically to eros, the symposium, and I quote some words from Rowe, Christopher Rowe, who says that this dialogue probably is one of the widest read and one and most admired of all Plato's works, end of quotation. Well, this is true, but I'm not interested in what Plato does in the symposium. What I'm mainly interested in is to show how Plato comes to detect two kinds of eros and whether these two kinds can be unified in a common notion without remainder. To do so, I think one must turn to Phaedrus, where I think one can see Plato struggling with this issue. So the topic of the conceptual unit of eros is one among many other issues Phaedrus is concerned with. The dialogue has a very complicated structure, but it will focus only on the problem of the conceptual unity of eros. It is particularly significant that this dialogue raises the issue on whether eros refers to something that is single. See, for instance, Phaedrus 263, D8, ton Erdon ton onton. I didn't mention it. I didn't put it on the handout. It is quite interesting that he is aware of this problem. He now wants to show us that eros has just one meaning. That section, which one may call disputable unities, runs from 261A to 264E, and is immediately followed by a discussion on dialectic method considered of as a practice of division. This practice runs according to two basic rules. This is well known. First, to gather things together, and then to divide them up in accordance with their natural joints. Until one comes to their definition, and one should refrain at all costs from breaking any part into pieces like an expert butcher. This is the expression at 265 E1 that can serve and has been quoted as a kind of motto to the method of division, to cut it up again, form by form, according to its natural joints. This is Rowe's translation of this well-known passage, 265 E1, Topalin kat eda dynasty diatemne kathastra hepefica. Now, what interests me mostly is the fact that once the practice of division is launched as the method Plato favors for discovering the nature of things, it has an expected outcome. Most of the time, the method of division is applied to units in the world, and then it divides them up in several species, proceeding fundamentally by dichotomies. However, division can sometimes end up with parts that are not at the same level as they are usually expected to be. This is particularly the case with eros, and which we will now examine in the light of what Phaedrus teaches about its nature. So, yes, good. So look at on page 2 of the handout, the text is 7. This comes from the Phaedrus 238 B7 to C7. In Socrates' first speech, love is defined as, and so this is my text 7, as is the non-rational appetite, is epithemia analogo, which has gained control over the opinion, which prompts to right conduct, born towards pleasure in beauty, and is forcefully reinforced by the appetites related to it in its pursuit of bodily beauty. Having overcome them in leadership, it takes its name from that very strength. This is the that passage. I have just read it in English translation. So the definition of love, of essential love, bodily love, is highly literary, with rhetorical tinctures, and contains in the end a hint at its etymology. This is the sort of love which is bodily or sensual love. Bodily love lies at the left side of the division, to be contrasted to the right side, in which lies, and now I quote Plato from the Phaedrus on 266 B7, the love which is in the right side is a love, I'm quoting Plato now, which shares the same name as the other, but it is divine, end of quotation. They bear the same name, so they are homonyma, but do they share one single nature of which they are the main divisions? Apparently, yes, according to 266 A2, and the text is hos hen in hemin pefikos eidos, adopting handoffs, suggestion that brings together the lessons of the different families of manuscripts. The idea is there is hen eidos, there is a unique form of these two kinds of laws. There are species of the same eidos. These two kinds of love are therefore envisaged as the two species. The division by dichotomies make us discover in madness. They are the two eide of madness, of mania. But I think things are not so seamless. So sorry. This text is I have just read. This is my point 8 on the handout. In the handout on page 2, comes from Phaedrus 266 A23. I'm just showing that there is some problems in the edition of it, but basically the idea is that one has one eidos, one single form for these two kinds of love. So the love in the left side and the love in the right side, the bodily or sensual love and the divine love. Well, one madness is caused by sickness of human thought, while the other, the divine love, comes about from a divinely caused reversal of our usual behavior. Or this is what he said at 265 A9 to 11. So the divine love is a divine gift, which is said twice in Phaedrus, while the former, the sensual or bodily love, is mirrored by the human excess and sickness. They are represented by the winged team of horses, which the charioteer has in charge in that well-known passage of the charioteer. In the case of human souls, one of the horses is good, of divine nature, it is elegant, but the other, and now I quote Plato, and I'm quoting Plato from 253 E1 to 5, and this is Rose translation. So this is how Plato describes the other horse, the other kind of love, the human love. This horse is, now quoting Plato, is crooked in shape, gross, a random collection of parts with a short, powerful neck, flat-nosed, black-skinned, gray-eyed, bloodshot, companion of excess and boastfulness, shaggy around the ears, deaf, hardly yielding to whip and gold together. End of quotation. This is Plato at the height of his literary skills, and in passing, he instills a non-negligible dose of prejudice as well. Well, both sides are said to be kinds of love, but they are opposed in a strongly contrasting fashion. The left and the right side are here not only relative positions, but are charged with tones and overtones. The left side is burdened with obscurities and prejudice. The right side is glorious and divine. Plato seems to recognize that there is something new here when he says that there are things about which we are in agreement and others about which we are at odds. He says this at Pedro's 263, A1 to 3. For Plato says, or has Socrates say, there are certain words, and the term is in 263, A6 onoma, there are certain words we all agree on, and he gives two examples, iron and silver, but there are others we disagree, and now I quote Plato again, both with each other and with ourselves, end of quotation. And the examples of the latter, so these notions we disagree, both with each other and with ourselves, are just and good. And these are two notions Aristotle will explore as attenuated or associated homonyms. As the dialogue unfolds, eros, love, is shown to be another member of these words about which we diverge and dispute. This is not only a problem of words, for it is rooted in the things themselves. It is surely not a problem of one group of people naming an object by a name and another group referring to the same thing by another name, or the same group using the same name for two different things. The problem here is the radical opposition between there is between the two kinds. These opposing kinds render their genus almost intractable, as one side is characterized as the human, sensual love, perfect and sick, and the other is the divine love, perfect and glorious. But both are said to be genuine cases of love. One cannot set them apart from one another, but the genus they are the species of cannot but engender disputes about their proper nature. This is an unexpected outcome of the method's division. The division has been correctly done, and nature has been cut up in its joints, but one ends up with two kinds that oppose each other so strongly that makes one pause and wonder. For one love comes from sickness of a human sort, while the other love has the elegance, divine nature's display. The left-hand love and the right-hand love are both love, but stand in highly contrasting ways. I'm about to conclude. Plato has stumbled upon a new sort of problem. So I think this is what is going on here. As the division ends up with such a contrasting result, one may ask oneself whether there really is a single thing to be divided into different species. So it's not as happens with iron or silver. One may rather be suspicious that from the start, there were two genera disguised under one single denomination, but differently from mere homonymy. Or is human sensual love in a significant way a kind of love according to which the divine love is also a love? At this juncture, one may object that what I'm doing is too much of a dramatization. There is indeed a genus of human and divine love, so runs the objection. And the genus is madness, as Plato says this, it's mania. And you can make good sense of mania as losing one's mind. Divination.
Sorry to interrupt. Just to tell you, we're at 45 minutes. So if you could go to the conclusion, I'm sorry. Thank you.
I'm going to the conclusion. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm about to conclude. Divination poetry and mystical rituals are cases of losing one's mind as well. The dialogue endeavors to show that Eros is losing one's mind to beauty, both to boy's beauty and to the intellectual beauty, the form of beauty, which is a sort of proxy for the other forms. Well, so the text says that there is a common genus, mania. But the problem is that you have two sides, and these sides are so contrasting, so different, that maybe we now have a problem, an unexpected problem. You have a notion that is somehow unified, but cannot be unified in terms of a common notion as the other universals are unified. So I skipped the other parts. I was just trying to show that, in which I was trying to show that there is a trouble with love. And the trouble with love is that it is split in a very particular way, not as an accidental homonymy. That is, it's not split into two separate meanings, but it is split nonetheless, and there are two distinct but related sensual or human love and divine love. Plato does not examine further this question, so we are left with no answer. And now I conclude quite quickly. What I'm interested in this notion of Eros split into two sides that are so contrasting that make us think of a non-generic unity is not something that only happens to love. There are other notions that you have, you provoke, you cause the same effect. One of them is pleasure in the Philebus. Is there a common definition of pleasure? Mixed and unmixed pleasures? Do they share a common definition, or they are correctly said to be kinds of pleasure, but they are connected in a different way? Another case which is quite interesting is friendship, and the lysis, the dialogue lysis, is a testimony of how perplexed Plato was when dealing with such a notion. So the idea is this: when Aristotle will deal with non-generic unity, he had lessons that he has discussed previously in the academy, and I think that you can find in some of Plato's dialogues traces of these discussions. So sorry for being too long. That was what I wanted to discuss. Thank you for your attention and for bearing with me in my English.
Thank you very much, Professor Marco Zingano. This was very interesting. Now we get to hear the commentary by Luiz Fernando Aguiar. So Luiz, you have the floor.
So you guys listen to me? It's okay? Okay.
I do.
I will. Okay. First, I will share my screen because I have a text. Is everyone seeing the text? Okay, is it possible to zoom this text? I don't really. Wait just a minute. It's better, or?
It was better before you did the last thing that you just did.
Okay. And what about now? Because I cannot see my sharing, so.
Oh, okay, now we just can't see the left part of it, but the font size is good.
Oh, okay. Now I see what I can do. What about now?
Yeah, that's good. This is almost going to the ophthalmologist, isn't it?
Okay, so
Go ahead.
okay. Well, first of all, I think my presentation, my comment presentation will have more or less than 15 minutes, between 12 and 15 minutes. So I think we are going into it, and it has 4 pages. So I will start now. First things first, I'd like to thank the people here present and the organizers of the event. Now, without further ado, I begin with my comment of the presentation. The question of the presentation could be formulated in the following terms. Why in Plato do some notions eschew a generic unity? Or why some notions like temperance, love, or friendship, for example, could not be easily put into a generic unity? Professor Zingano's thesis, in a nutshell, is that, first, Plato fails to show how temperance is unifiable in the same gender by an accidental homonym, and Professor Zingano also shows how love is kind of unifiable, but with the problem still persisting. And 2, the problems that Plato faces to deal with the universals or to the generic unity, keep being researched by the members of the Academy, especially for this presentation by Aristotle in terms of non-generic unity. For example, we have the notion of being in the categories. The thesis is defended in the following way. First, Professor Zingano delineates the meaning of generic unity that he is to use in the text in Plato and Aristotle. Then he presents the 2 cases at hand, the case of temperance and the case of love. Then he concludes that the research program of the Academy will try to devise, with Aristotle, other ways to think about the universals, the non-generic unities. For the sake of the argument, I'd like to propose a discussion less centered on a specific notion of Platonic lexicon and more centered on a general proposal, starting from an essay from Francisco Gonzalez, whose title is Non-Propositional Knowledge in Plato. In this text, the author defends an approach between the Republic and Meno with what became known as the 7th letter. The thesis of the letter, as presented by Gonzalez, is as it follows. Quote, there are indeed, according to the letter, 3 things that are indispensable for obtaining knowledge: the name of a thing, its definition, and its image. Knowledge itself is listed as a fourth thing distinct from these three. The object of knowledge, what's truly being, is a fifth thing. Each of the three means of attaining knowledge is described as having its own peculiar weaknesses. A name is unstable because its application is determined entirely by convention. A definition shares the instability of the words that make it up, and a sensible image is full of what is opposed to that of which it's the image. The letter asserts, however, that there is a greater weakness than these specifics, a weakness that it attributes to logoi. The logoi must refer more generally to language as a whole or to propositions, end quote. Given these characteristics, especially the weakness attributed to language and propositional knowledge, we could ask, wouldn't it be the case to consider that in Plato, some notions never fall into a generic unity, as Professor Zingano pointed out with 2 examples? Wouldn't it be because of this that Plato always resorts to mythological elements to organize his more general framework? 2 being the second question. And 3, wouldn't these mythological narratives be an attempt to describe what would be the non-propositional aspect of knowledge, without needing to organize the problem in terms of generic unit per se? Well, I will not even try to answer these questions in this comment. I'd like just to point out the way Gonzalez presents his way of thinking about the problem. Going back to Gonzalez's essay, what is non-propositional knowledge anyway? Let's look at some excerpts. Quote, let us imagine a case in which knowledge of some acts is not identical with, or is not exhausted by, knowledge of what can truly be asserted, that is, knowledge that X is Y. In this case, although we can still formulate propositions concerning the thing in question, and although these propositions may be true in some way, knowledge of the thing itself is non-propositional. More positively, to say that something exists as non-propositional knowledge is to say that something can be manifested without being describable. End quote. Here Gonzalez introduces the possibility that knowledge of something is not exhausted by the set of its propositions. The thesis is opposed, for example, to the thesis he quotes from Gail Fine, and that could be the thesis from, for example, Plastos or Devereux, etc. It is worth appreciating Fine's text as it appears in Gonzalez. Now I quote, knowledge of things for Plato depends on description, not on independent description. Second, Plato tends to speak alternately of knowing X and knowing what X is. Thus, a sentence of the form, A knows X, can always be transformed into a sentence of the form, A knows what X is, and the later in turn is easily transformed into A knows that X is F. End quote. In other words, Fine's thesis requires the centrality of propositional knowledge in Plato, in this case, early dialogues. Gonzalez then presents the core of his proposal. I start quoting, "A meaningful description predicts I of X correctly or incorrectly. Therefore, it must be either true or false. In the case of non-propositional knowledge, on the other hand, what is known is not a proposition that can be true or false of X, but rather X itself." I have an emphasis for that, rather X itself. End quote. In Gonzalez, then, there are some elements that may come to make up non-propositional knowledge. The characteristics of these elements would be not to be exhausted by propositions. The thing itself is known, not only some equality of the thing, which he attributes to Aristotle, metaphysics, or ontology. And C, it admits degrees. This is negation of the true or false horizon. And the elements could be practical knowledge, self-knowledge, and I think the more important, non-analyzable or primitive objects. Gonzalez acknowledged that it's not easy to detail aspects of non-propositional knowledge and how this relates to Plato's dialogues. However, he affirms that it is possible to show how the thesis holds firm even in Meno and the Republic. The author says, now I start quoting, "The aim of the present paper is more limited and negative. To encourage and pave the way for such work, showing that the dialogues discussed are not committed to propositional conception of knowledge, and that some of the texts that have been taken to presuppose such a commitment point in the opposite direction." End quote. In other words, if Gonzalez's thesis is correct, the goal of the Platonic dialogues is not the definition itself, but show how it would be possible to think of the path of a definition as an anamnesis, we could say in a performative way. This position becomes clear when Gonzalez describes some aspects of Meno and the Republic. However, we will see this in another opportunity. So to conclude, let's retake our main question. Why in Plato do some notions eschew a generic unity? Or why some notions like temperance, for example, couldn't be easily put into a generic unity? Perhaps the answer is because the language is too poor to describe the world and its objects, in view of our already given knowledge of the thing in itself made possible by the performing of anamnesis, or mutatis mutandis, by considering that the definitions that we propose are only significant if we consider the cosmological structure that gives meaning to these definitions in a given system, a problem not related to a generic unit per se. In this sense, it is possible to think with Gonzalez that the Aristotelian theory could be seen as too optimistic in the descriptive capacities of our language, and that the non-generic unity as a research thing could be thought as a thing that is markedly present in Plato as well as in Aristotle. Well, Gonzalez's thesis is polemical enough, but we could see that there is at least one other line of investigation about generic unity in Plato that does not require the horizon of Aristotle or the one, for example, of the analytical philosophy. Both being, I admit, my preference on the matter. Now, I think we could start our discussion. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Luiz, for your insightful commentary and your questions. Professor Marco Zingano, would you like to answer to Luiz's commentary?
Well, first of all, thank you, Fernando, for your comments. They're quite interesting. I'm afraid I wasn't clear in what I was trying to do. I was trying to show that what Aristotle is doing does not come out of the blue. I mean, when he looks for different ways of non-generic unities, my goal was quite limited, was just to show that we can see traces of this sort of discussion in Plato's dialogues. For instance, when he stays quite firm and says that sophronism has only has a single nature, and this single nature connects together both self-control and soundness of mind. But I was also trying to show that there are in other moments, as when Plato discusses the definition of eros, or the ways the divisions about mania into sides for the eros, that now he stumbles over some a slightly different problem. Now you have two sides which are so contrasting that you have now a problem for saying that there is a common genus for them. There are other notions I could have explored, but they are quite difficult to put in light, and as the pleasure, the definition of pleasure, and this terrible dialogue, Lysis on the French. So this is compatible with reading as you advocate the reading of a non-proposition knowledge, Plato doing other things. Okay, there's no problem. He is doing other things. It may be what he is doing is exactly what you say he is doing. That's possible. I'm not discussing this. What I'm saying is just that there are some aspects of what he is doing in which we can see that he was aware of a discussion. That seems quite possible because there was someone amongst these people who are discussing a thing, named Aristotle, and Aristotle was quite interested in this kind of thing. So that was my point. And maybe I wasn't clear enough to say that it was a quite limited point. It's just to show that there are some problematic notions that Plato tried to cope with somehow, quite different from the way Aristotle did it. But these notions are there, and you can find them in some of his dialogues. Otherwise, I do agree with part of what you have said, and they are quite interesting. Anyway, thank you very much for this.
Thank you for your response, Professor Marco. So if anyone wants to ask a question, I'd ask them to please raise their virtual hands. I'll start. So I have something, actually, I'm gonna give the, okay, I'll start then. It's more of a generic question, but something that you mentioned that interests me very much, Professor, is I'd just like to know what your opinion is on what would Aristotle's and Plato's take on the philosophical utility of investigating natural language be then? I could see from your argument that their takes are very different, but I would love to see you just go a little bit more deeply into this. Thank you.
No, I think this is a quite interesting question and very rewarding one when we look at in details. It's quite difficult to give an answer now and to this sketch a sort of big panorama about this, the relationship of both of them towards natural language. But let me just highlight some aspects of this problem. And this is connected with the Sophrosini case, which is, for me, it's quite interesting to see how Plato tries to, he sticks to this idea that there is one single notion for Sophrosini. And in fact, Sophrosini, as it is used in the common language, has these two dimensions, right? Of course, this single notion is quite useful for Plato because this goes in the same direction, in the direction of the argument he wants to do in order to prove the unit of virtues. So he, in some sort, he is quite sensitive to the natural language in the way that in common parlances, Sophrosini, to be sophron means two things, right? To be sound-minded, soundness of mind, and to be self-controlled. Whereas when you look at Aristotle, he just goes for one of these meanings. And Aristotle is supposed to be much more sensitive to the way people talk, the natural language. But this is a quite interesting case in which Aristotle is rather interested in correcting, in regimenting the language, whereas Plato was much more at easy with usage. Sorry, I cannot answer your question. This is a big question. It's quite interesting. But this is a case in which you have the contrary you would expect to find when you think of Plato as regimented language and Aristotle being much more sensitive to the way people talk. You have now quite a different approach.
Thank you. Jessica?
Yeah, thanks. So thanks, Marco, for a really interesting talk and interesting comments. So I'm very sympathetic to the idea that Plato thinks some things don't form a real unity. And particularly you mentioned towards the end, pleasure in the Philebus. And I've often wondered, does he think there is a form of pleasure? He doesn't say there is. Maybe pleasure is best understood as some kind of process towards the good or imitation or something. But I'm much more cautious about the idea that sophrosune falls into that class because it's a virtue, and it's a virtue that he holds on to, in the Republic and elsewhere. And I mean, I just want to, and I'm sorry if I missed in your discussion of the Protagoras, I'm not sure I entirely tracked, but you have, there's this problem, and then you have on page 2 of your handout, you have the way out for the problem. And the way out is to say, well, that there's really two different senses of aphrosune, aphrosune 1 and aphrosune 2. Of course, the other way out is to reject claim 4, which is that wisdom is different from temperance. And it seems like in the context of the Protagoras, that's the way that Plato wants us to go, right? So this turns out to be a false, there's a false assumption that leads to this dilemma. So if we went that way, then we could say, yeah, really temperance is one unified kind. It's wisdom, and maybe it's wisdom about a certain domain, if we want to go that way or not. But anyhow, I wondered if I think your main point would still hold, that Aristotle can look to Plato for kind of this idea, even if it's not an idea that we see Socrates endorsing. But I wondered if you had reasons for thinking that Plato really does wind up thinking that sophrosune is not a unity, a real generic unity.
Oh, thank you very much, Jessica, for raising this question. And now I'm afraid I was so obscure in my talk that I put it on the wrong track.
Sorry, I may have just felt.
No, my idea is this, is that Protagoras could have said as a way out that aphrosine,
right,
if it has two contraries and these notions it is contrary, they are different. So aphrosine itself has two different meanings, but it's not what Plato wants. Plato wants to show that you have to drop the thesis according to which wisdom and temperances are distinct. So this is Plato's thesis. And this is why it is a false start, because Plato thinks that there is a single notion for sophrosine, in contrast to which suppose Aristotle is quite clear that you have two distinct notions. And in the common language, we do speak of a sovereign being, either someone who is self-controlled or someone who is quite smart, right? And I suppose, maybe wrongly, but I suppose that Aristotle would say that these two meanings make up a sort of accidental harmony. They are not connected in the way you should expect being to be connected or good to be connected. So that was my idea. I'm very sorry if I wasn't clear.
No, that's very helpful. Sorry, I should have got that, but that's very helpful. Yeah, good. And then I guess just to push it a little further. So if you think, yeah, as far as Plato is concerned, right, self-pursuing really is a unity. He doesn't go the Protagoras way out. I mean, just to invite you to think, why might the case of pleasure be different, or maybe the case of eros be different, or mania? Are the, Plato often associates unity with the good enough that maybe possibly at the end of his life he gave a lecture on the good in which he said it was the one. So could that be the idea that genuinely good things are genuine unities, and which doesn't seem like a very Aristotelian idea, but
yeah, it is. But well, the idea I was trying to defend it is that Plato was being pressed by some people, namely Aristotle and other companions maybe, about the unity of certain notions, and he tried to give us a common definition, a single nature, but things were getting more and more difficult. And well, better than I, the problems connect with pleasure, and those two quite different kinds of pleasure, whether you can still hold to the idea of one and same nature for them. It is possible to see them and to read the Philebus in this way, but maybe Philebus can also be quite useful as a testimony of problems connected with this sort of pursuit. Pleasure is the troublemaker in the sense that it's not too easy to find what would be its common genus. So that was this is why I found the word troublemaker. And the idea that love is also a troublemaker is not bad, right?
Good. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Carolina?
Thank you, Marcus. That was very interesting. I just want to listen to you a little bit more to some objection, which is you created a narrative that there was the academy and there was some discussions and Aristotle was pushing Plato into something. That can be true. But the problem is there's this idea that Plato was concerned with non-generic notions and concerned with establishing different meanings. This kind of probably an assumption with which we read the text than something we can take very straightforward out of the text. So there is like a tendency now that we have to read Plato thinking that he's concerned with things and not with meanings. I think Terry Penner is the champion of this position against philosophy of language as a whole. So he's referring to things, he's referring to natures and things in the world. So he's not concerned with distinguishing meanings. And I wonder what you would say in response to that objection, that, okay, what Plato is doing is investigating what things are. So for example, in In the Protagoras, the argument is about what Afrosyne is. And since Afrosyne is this, so that follows. And of course, Eros and things like this. So I wonder, what would you say in reply? Thank you so much.
Thanks, Carolina. This is also a big question, and that's the answer to it will take us too far. Let me just say 2 or 3 things. I don't like the term narrative. I don't think I'm just doing a narrative, because I think we can detect in Plato's dialogues traces of a discussion concerning certain notions that elude or are quite difficult. And to my mind, Plato makes all the effort to put them on the right track, in the sense of putting them in order to find them a common genus. And this is what he does for love. This is what he does for pleasure. My problem is that he is reacting or responding to some problems. And I suppose that these problems were raised by people with whom he was discussing. And that's from maybe the benefit from hindsight. You can see that Aristotle was so keen on having this non-generic unities. You can suppose quite plausibly that one of them was Aristotle. So this is the first part. The second part is a much more difficult question about what Plato is really interested in. I suppose that he was trying to get things right and to understand the nature of things, but I don't think how he could have been doing this without assigning to these things onomata and connecting to this onomata logoi. And this logoi, I don't need the 7th letter. I can just refer, for instance, to the laws or other texts from Plato's. These logoi are definitions that say what these things are, and then the onomata somehow compress this definition, sometimes to the point of unrecognizable compression, but there is some connection with naming things in some way and defining them with some formulas or propositions. So I would go in this direction, and let me just try to clear, but this is it's for myself, because I'm trying to go in this direction. This is just the new point of research I'm interested in. I would say that it's not that Plato is concerned with this. This is a point he has to deal with, because as a philosopher, he is recognizing that there are some problems. I insisted in the idea that the method of division had an unexpected outcome or result. And this unexpected upshot is that you can end up with a corrected division, but with sides which are so contrasting that you may wonder whether they belong to the same genus. This cannot happen if you follow what Plato's present as his customary method in Republic 10, because we postulate, this is the hypothesis, that there is a multiplicity of thing referred by a name in a non-homonymous fashion. And so this is that, this is it. It's already secure that you have that unit and you have just go and find it. But when you do the way of the division, you may end up with some troublemakers. And all I want is that a good reader of Plato, as you, will recognize that there are some troublemakers. And these troublemakers will make other people to reflect in other direction, not in the same direction as Plato did with them. I mean, Aristotle's, for instance, with friendship, it's so I want to elucidate this mystery of why Aristotle was so keen on having three kinds of friendship, which are not species of the same genus, albeit they are connected somehow and cannot be disconnected as an accidental homonymy can. So this is the main idea. This is not an answer for the question raised, but these are some steps towards an answer.
Okay, I think we have.
Thank you.
Sorry, I think we have time for one more question. So Pedro, if you could do it quickly, though. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Zingano, for this very illuminating, great talk. So I had a question about Plato's sophists, because when you approach the problem of non-generic unity, you spoke about the Phaedrus and also Protagoras. I was thinking of a much later dialogue, the sophists, if you take the conventional reading of Plato's chronology, would you say that the greatest kinds in the sophists, the Megistagene, the being on being, movement and rest, is somehow development or refinement in Plato's parts in approaching the problem of non-generic unity, in giving some further coherence or order in the domain of forms by postulating some specific kinds of form that would play a greater explanatory role or ontological role in organizing the whole domain of forms. So I don't know if your research goes in that direction, but I would like to know, what do you think about the greatest kinds, the Megistagene of the sophists, in relation to this discussion of non-generic unity in between Plato and Aristotle? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Pedro. This is a quite interesting question, and I don't have a precise answer to it, but my feeling is this, is that in the sophists, as well as in other late dialogues, Plato is trying to rethink his theory of forms, not exactly in order to cope with or to eliminate or whatever the non-generic unities, but some problems out of which the question can be raised about well-formed unities that do not follow the pattern of universality. So I think this is the idea. This is a sort of product of this discussion that is going on in these late dialogues, but they are centered in the theory of forms from other points of view, not exactly. So I mean, the non-generic unities are not the main focus on these discussions. I don't think you could think of these five kinds as a sort of instrumental or a conceptual tool in order to deal with them, but the non-generic unities will come out as a sort of byproduct of all these discussions. So this is quite general. I had to develop more at this point, and I thank you for the direction you indicated to me.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Marcos Zingano. And with this, we come to the end of Plato just for today. But this is also with my firm hope that we'll repeat this event in the future. I'd like to thank again all the people who participated in the event, both the professors who gave talks, the commentators, people in the audience. This was a lot of fun. I hope you also had as much fun as I had, and also my co-organizers, Pedro and Luiz. And once again, thank you very much. It's hard to say goodbye, but I think we have to do it. And then this is hoping to see you all next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, thank you.
all.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Professor. Bye-bye.